The world collapsed 8 years ago. Now people kill for a can of stew. And the system dumped this man into a dead warehouse with a corpse by the wall and gave him a class. Not a warrior, not a mage, a storekeeper. Daniel Reyes opens his eyes and sees a gray ceiling with a hole the size of a dining table. Through the hole, he sees a sky the color of an old newspaper, dead, flat. The cold comes from below, from the concrete, from the floor slab that has absorbed years of dampness. The air hits his nose with the smell of rust and something sour. Dan turns his head. Cracked shelves stretch back into the depths like the ribs of a dead whale, and bones lie against the wall, human, in shreds of a brown jacket. A skull stares with empty eye sockets into the same hole. Dan sits down. His hands are shaking, not from fear, from the cold. The last thing he remembers is the headlights in a parking lot outside Chicago. 3 a.m, end of shift, and darkness. He feels his chest. His ribs are intact. He touches his head. No blood. His heart beats steadily. He's alive. Or not alive. Or something else. Dan stands up. He brushes off his jeans and does what he's done every morning for 7 years straight. He counts. 40 meters by 20. 6-meter ceiling. 4 rows of shelves. 2 are piled high. 1 is empty. Something stands on the last one. The gate on the south side is jammed but not welded shut. The door on the east side is ajar. A draft is blowing through. And that's when something strange happens. Right in front of his face, a window flashes in the air, semi-transparent, bluish. Warehouse number 0, emergency condition, begin restoration. Dan stares at the letters for 5 seconds. 10. Then he sits back down on the cold concrete and laughs quietly. It's not a happy laugh. It's the kind of laugh that comes when your brain doesn't know what else to do. Well, at least they didn't change my profession. And the laughter stops, because a thought occurs to him. If there's a system, if it's asking about restoration, that means someone put it here. That means they're expecting something from him. Dan reaches out and touches the word yes. The window flashes. A new one pops up in its place. Inventory has begun. Time, 4 hours. Do not leave the perimeter. And a line at the bottom in small print. Operator, Daniel Reyes. Specialization, warehouse clerk. He reads it twice. Warehouse clerk. Not a warrior, not a mage, not a hunter. A man who counts boxes and makes sure nothing goes missing. And with that, they've dumped him into the dead world. Dan stands up. 4 hours of inventory. At the old warehouse, he used to do Section B in 3.5. 200 pallets, 14,000 items. So he won't be sitting around here with nothing to do either. He walks along the perimeter, clockwise, just like they taught him. The east wall is holding up. The south wall with the gate is rusty, but the hinges are intact. The west wall is wet. Water is leaking from above. If it isn't patched up before the cold weather sets in, the wall will start to crumble. He returns to the shelf and sits down. On the bottom shelf are cans, 12 of them, canned goods. The labels have faded, but the seams are intact, no bulging. Peas. He takes one and puts it back in exactly the same spot. Habit. Every item stays where it belongs. 12 cans is 6,000 calories. 3 days' worth for one person. Not much. Dan climbs down into the basement. The hatch is hidden in the northeast corner under dust and cardboard. Heavy, but it gives way. It's dark down there and reeks of dampness. 9 steps down an iron staircase. 4 barrels along the wall. 3 are empty. The 4th contains sauerkraut. Alive. Stinking so bad it makes his eyes water. He dips a finger in the brine and tastes it. Unbearably sour. But it's vitamin C. It's life. Next to it, on the dirt floor, is a sack. Dan unties it. Potatoes. Shriveled. Old. But with white sprouts stretching out to the sides like fingers. The tubers are alive. They want to go into the ground. And here, for the first time, Dan's throat tightens. Not from fear, from understanding. Someone put the potatoes here. Someone left the cabbage. Someone put the jars on the shelf. and died by the wall in a brown jacket. This person was preparing the storage room and didn't make it, and now Dan is here. He goes upstairs with the sack in his hands, and the window pops up again. Inventory is 20% complete. 8 kilograms of seed potatoes, 11 days of autonomy, module ready to be unlocked, basic roof repairs, ensure the room is airtight. And an old familiar mechanism clicks in his head, the one that kicked in when a truck arrived with 3,000 items and everything had to be processed in 2 hours. No panic, no inspiration, work mode, roof first. Dan walks out the east door. The world outside looks like scorched earth, a gray sky stretching to the horizon. The grass is yellow and sparse. The road is 100 meters away. A rusted bus wreck on the shoulder. A field. Beyond the field, a forest, but half the trees are leafless. The sun is out, but it's dim, like a lamp at half. Dan stands there for a minute. Then he goes to look for materials. In the bus, he finds sheets of paneling, aluminum. It bends easily. In the bushes, scraps of sheet metal and a coil of wire, a canister. In 2 hours, he hauls a pile of materials to the warehouse. He builds a ladder out of shelving units and wire. Crooked, wobbly, but it holds. He patches the hole in the roof in 4 hours. Overlapping aluminum, wire fasteners, not pretty, but dry. He climbs down and stands under the patch. It's warmer inside, maybe by a degree or two, but warmer. The system flashes. Mission accomplished. Module unlocked. Temperature control level 0. Passive. The walls now hold the heat a little better. The cracks are a little narrower. The drafts are weaker. It's as if the building has pulled itself together, and Dan feels it, as if someone is placing a hand on his shoulder and saying quietly, "Good, that's better. Keep going." Evening is falling. Dan is sitting on the floor eating cold peas from a can. 300 grams, 500 calories, 11 cans left. He can't eat potatoes. Potatoes are seeds. Potatoes are the future. He looks at the gray square of sky through the small window near the ceiling. There's a rumbling somewhere on the road. Maybe thunder. Maybe a landslide. He doesn't know anything about this world yet. He doesn't know that the silence has lasted 8 years. He doesn't know about the fortress cities or the collectors. He doesn't know that people kill for a sack of flour. He knows one thing. He has a warehouse. The warehouse has walls. There is food inside the walls. And the system said he is a storekeeper. So he will do what he knows how to do. Count, store, keep things from going to waste. Dan finishes his peas. He washes the can with the remaining water. He sets the empty one apart from the full ones. Empty with empty, full with full. He lies down. He puts a sack of potatoes under his head and closes his eyes. Tomorrow will be the second day. Tomorrow he'll plant potatoes. He doesn't know exactly where yet, but the grass is growing on the street, so the earth is alive. So it's possible. Dan woke up to the sound of something tapping on the roof. Rain. Light and frequent. He opened his eyes and looked up first thing. The patch was holding. Not a single drop was seeping inside. Good. So yesterday's work wasn't in vain. He sat up and rubbed his face. His whole body ached. A concrete floor isn't the best bed. His back muscles were tight, and his neck cracked as he turned it. The system window flashed before his eyes. Day 2. 10 days of autonomy with a single operator. Tasks available for completion. First, organize a landing zone. Second, secure a water source. Third, secure the perimeter. Dan read the list and nodded. The system thought like him, or he thought like the system. It made no difference. Water. That was the first thing. Rain pounded on the roof and ran down somewhere from the edges. Dan went outside. Streams of water ran down the walls and disappeared into the ground. Just disappeared. Not a single gutter, not a single barrel. All that water was going to waste. He stood in the light rain and watched as liters of life were absorbed into the mud. Then he went back inside. A canister, empty barrels from the basement, pieces of tin from the road. In 3 hours, he put together a system, a very simple one. Water from the roof flowed down a gutter made of bent tin into a canister. From the canister, through a hole with a filter made of several layers of fabric that he'd cut from the dead man's jacket upstairs. Dan hesitated for a moment. He looked at the bones. Then he said aloud that he was taking the jacket, and that if that man could hear him, he should know it would serve a good purpose. Maybe it was silly, but he felt better. The filtered water flowed into a plastic barrel he'd hauled up from the basement. By noon, there were already 5 liters. The rain hadn't stopped. The system flashed. Task partially completed. Water source detected. Passive rainwater collection. Efficiency 12%. Recommendation to increase collection area. 12%. Dan snorted. At the old warehouse, a 12% efficiency rating meant getting fired. But here, it was just the beginning. He drank a mug of water. He had repurposed a tin can of peas as a mug. The water was a bit cloudy. It tasted of tin and fabric. But it was water. Free of the worst of the dirt. He had nothing to boil it with yet, but it would do for now. His stomach growled. Dan opened a second can of peas. 10 left. 10 days. If he didn't find another source of food in 10 days, starvation would set in. Potatoes. He pulled out the sack and spread the tubers on the floor. 23 of them. Small, shriveled, but each with sprouts. 23 chances. If he planted them now, the first harvest would be in 2.5 to 3 months. That is, if the soil was suitable, if the temperature didn't drop too much, if no pest devoured the sprouts. A lot of ifs, but there were no other options. Dan went outside with a shovel. He'd found the shovel behind the bus on the road. Rusty, the handle was cracked, but it was usable. He chose a spot on the south side of the warehouse. Here, the wall created a small pocket. The wind was weaker there. And if the dim sun warmed anything at all, it was right here. The soil turned out to be heavy, clayey, compacted over the years. The first shovelful came with difficulty. The second was easier. The third went smoothly. Half an hour later, Dan had dug up a 2x3 meter patch, 6 square meters. The soil inside was better than on the surface, dark, full of worms, alive. That was a good sign. He cut each tuber into pieces, so that each piece had at least 2 eyes. From 23 potatoes, he got 41 planting pieces. He put them in the ground, not deep, about 8 centimeters. He watered them from a barrel, 1 liter for the whole bed. Economical, very economical. Then he stood there looking at this wet rectangle of earth and thought that this is probably how it all begins. Not with grand plans, not with armies and fortresses, with a 2x3 meter garden bed. The system flashed. Planting zone organized. Area, 6 square meters. Crop, potatoes. Expected yield under current conditions, 14 kilograms. Time from planting to harvest, 82 days. Module available for unlocking. Greenhouse, level 1. Task to be completed. Provide a round-the-clock ration for at least 3 people for 7 days. Dan reread the last line. At least 3 people. He had 10 cans of peas. 30 liters of cabbage, water, and he was alone. To unlock the greenhouse, he needed people. He needed people. The thought was strange. For 7 years, he had worked mostly alone. Night shifts, the silence of the warehouse, the hum of the refrigerators, the clicks of the scanner. He liked the solitude. But the system was clear. You can't do this alone. Dan spent the rest of the day working on the perimeter. He opened the gate. 3 hours and half a bottle of motor oil he'd found on the bus. The oil was old and thick, but the hinges gave way. The gate now opened and closed. With difficulty, with a creak, but they worked. He fashioned a bolt from an iron pipe. He could lock himself in at night. He fixed the east door, too. He put a wire lock on it. Not protection against a serious attack, but at least something. The system confirmed. Perimeter secured. Security level low. Recommendation, set up an observation post. An observation post. Dan climbed onto the roof. He could see far from here. The road ran southwest and disappeared behind the hills. To the northeast was a forest. To the east, a field. To the west, another road. And on that road, far, far away, some structures. Maybe a city. Maybe ruins. You couldn't tell from here. He stood on the roof and, for the first time in 2 days, really thought. Where was he? What had happened to this world? Why was the sky gray? Why was there a dead body in the warehouse basement and canned food on the shelf? The system didn't answer these questions. It gave him tasks. Practical, concrete. Fix it, plant it, assemble it, feed it. As if it were telling him, don't think about what you can't change. Think about what you can. At night, he woke up to a sound. Footsteps outside. Quiet. Cautious. 2 people, maybe 3. Dan lay on the floor and listened. His heart was racing. He wasn't a fighter. He knew that about himself very clearly. The last time he'd fought was in 9th grade, and he'd lost. The footsteps stopped at the gate. A quiet conversation. Then a knock. Not loud, almost polite. Dan didn't answer. The knock came again. Then a voice, young, hoarse. Is anyone inside? We don't want any trouble. We need water. Dan lay there and thought. 10 cans of peas, 30 liters of cabbage, a barrel of water, 41 potato plants in the ground, and a system that demands feeding 3 people. He got up, walked to the gate, unbolted it, pulled the gate open. 2 men stood on the threshold, skinny, young. One looked to be about 20, the other no older than 17. The older one held a sawed-off shotgun. The barrel was pointed downward, but his finger was near the trigger. The younger one had a knife on his belt. Their clothes were torn, dirty. They wore mismatched shoes. On the older one's left leg was a bandage stained brown with dried blood. Dan looked at them and saw. He truly saw. The system had activated on its own. Or he had activated it without noticing. But markers appeared before his eyes. Above the older one's head were translucent numbers. Estimated remaining time given the current condition. 26 days. For the younger one, 41 days. 26 days. This guy with the sawed-off shotgun had 26 days left to live. Dan didn't show that he could see this. He just looked at the wound on his leg and said he knew the guy had an open infection, that gangrene would set in 3 days if it hadn't already. The older one tensed up. He gripped the sawed-off shotgun tighter, said they didn't need a doctor. They needed water and food. Dan nodded, said he had water. He had cabbage and peas. Then he said they had a sawed-off without 2 rounds. He'd heard them drop them in the grass along the road. The older man turned pale. How do you know? Dan didn't answer that question. He didn't know how. The system just showed it. A sawed-off, 12-gauge, 2-round capacity, 0 rounds loaded. Dan said that if they took his food, they'd both be dead in a week because they didn't know what to do with it. You can't eat cabbage on an empty, sick stomach. Peas need to be heated properly or they'll turn to stone in your guts. And a wounded leg needs to be washed and bandaged. He can do all that, if they stay until morning. The guys exchanged glances. The younger one looked at the older one. The older one looked at Dan. Then he lowered the sawed-off, said they'd stay. But if he tried anything, they'd leave. Dan opened the gate wider and let them in. He warmed up the peas over a small fire he'd built in an iron barrel right in the warehouse. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. He hadn't figured out a ventilation system yet, but it would do for one night. The older one's name was Marcus. The younger one was Tommy. Brothers. Not blood brothers, but they called each other brothers. Marcus told his story in bits and pieces. They were coming from a town in the south. The town was called Linden. It was. Now it isn't. The collectors came 3 weeks ago. They took everything. Those who resisted were killed. Those who didn't resist were robbed and driven out. Marcus and Tommy were heading north because they'd heard there was a place somewhere up there where they let people in. Dan asked what kind of place. Marcus shrugged, said it was just a rumor. Some valley, warm water, fresh bread, lights in the evenings. Dan thought it sounded like a fairy tale, but he didn't say anything. He washed Marcus's wound. It was bad. A deep cut on his shin. Dirty. The edges were swollen, red. Pus had already started to ooze out. Dan washed it with water mixed with cabbage brine. The acid disinfects. Not ideal, but better than nothing. He bandaged it with a clean strip of fabric from a dead man's jacket. Marcus clenched his teeth and didn't make a sound. Then Dan looked at Tommy. The boy was smiling, but his gums were dark. His teeth were loose. Scurvy. A severe vitamin C deficiency. Dan gave him a bowl of sauerkraut, told him to eat slowly, 1 spoonful at a time. Don't rush. Tommy ate, and his eyes were wet, not from pain, from the taste. He hadn't eaten anything sour in a long time. Sour meant alive. That night, the 3 of them slept on the warehouse floor. Marcus with a sawed-off shotgun at his side, Dan by the shelving unit, Tommy between them. In the morning, Dan woke up first and saw that the system had updated. 3 people on the premises. Rations secured for 24 hours. The mission countdown has begun. Feed 3 people for 7 days. 6 days left. Dan looked at the sleeping guys. 26 days. 41 days. No, he wouldn't let that happen. He started making breakfast. Peas and cabbage. Half a can for the 3 of them. Frugal, but nutritious. Iron from the peas, vitamin C from the cabbage, calories, fiber, all by the book. By his book. By the book of a warehouse manager who had monitored food storage temperatures for 7 years and knew every figure for every batch by heart. Marcus woke up to the smell of food. He sat up. He looked at Dan. He said Dan was strange. Dan replied that he was a storekeeper. Marcus didn't get it. Dan didn't bother explaining. A week went by. Marcus and Tommy stayed. Every day Dan gave them tasks. Marcus repaired the walls. He had hands. Heavy, rough hands that knew how to work with metal and wood. He patched the cracks in the east wall in 2 days. Tommy helped with the water. He hauled barrels. He filtered. He kept an eye on the levels. Marcus's wound began to heal on the 3rd day. Dan changed the bandages every 12 hours. The cabbage brine was working. The mark above Marcus's head had changed. 26 days turned into 104. Dan saw it in the morning on 4th day and turned away so no one would notice his hands shaking. It was working. Every bandage, every bowl of food, every liter of clean water, all of it moved the numbers. He wasn't building a city. He was postponing someone's death. On the 7th day, the system flashed. Mission accomplished. Rations for 3 people secured for 7 days. Module unlocked. Greenhouse level 1. And a new line at the bottom. Settlement trust, level 1. New ability. Others' hands can do more. Dan read the description. Any person working inside the warehouse under his supervision receives a skill bonus. He looked at Marcus, who was repairing a shelf at that moment. His movements were more precise than yesterday, more confident. As if Marcus had been doing this his whole life, even though just a week ago he couldn't even hold a hammer properly because his right hand was shaking from the infection. The system was working. Not through him, through them. The 1st level greenhouse turned out not to be a building, not a glass dome, not something out of science fiction. The system simply highlighted an area. A rectangle of land on the south side of the warehouse, 8 by 4 meters, 32 square meters. And it said that everything planted in this zone would grow 30% faster, that the soil temperature inside the zone would be 2 degrees higher than the surrounding area, that pests would bypass the zone's perimeter. Not magic, the effect of the right spot. Dan stood and looked at this invisible rectangle. Then he transplanted the potatoes. Every tuber from the old bed into the new zone, carefully, by hand. Tommy helped. When they finished, the system displayed a new timeline. The expected yield under current conditions was 21 kilograms, 57 days until harvest. It had been 14 kilograms in 82 days. Now it was 21 in 57. Dan nodded. That was good, but not enough. 21 kilograms of potatoes is about 16,000 calories. For 3 people, that's about 18 days. And 57 days until harvest means 57 days they'd have to live on what they had. 8 cans of peas, cabbage, water. They had to go looking. Dan left Marcus in charge and went out on a reconnaissance mission. For the first time in 10 days, he ventured more than 30 meters from the warehouse and immediately felt the difference. It was as if someone had turned off the quiet hum in the background. Inside the perimeter, he could sense the building. Every crack, every mouse. Outside, he was just a man. A tired 29-year-old in dirty jeans and boots. The road to the southwest led him to a fork after 2 hours of walking. The left path led to the buildings he'd seen from the roof. The right one went somewhere into the woods. He took the left. The buildings turned out to be the remains of a small town. 30 houses, half of them burned down, the rest looted. Doors smashed in, windows empty. On the main street, a rusty pickup truck without wheels. A store with a smashed-in window. Inside, it was empty. The shelves were bare, broken glass and trash on the floor. People had been here, many times. They took everything they could. Dan took his time. He went from house to house, unhurriedly, as if taking inventory, methodically. Every room, every closet, every basement. Most were empty, but the system had taught him one thing. People don't know how to search. They take what they see, and they see what's at eye level. Dan looked higher and lower. In the third house, behind a pushed-aside washing machine, he found a crack in the wall. Behind the crack was a small niche. In the niche were 5 cans of stewed beef. The real stuff. Beef. Someone had hidden them and never came back. In the fifth house, in the attic, under a pile of old newspapers, lay a first aid kit. Bandages, antiseptic in a sealed bottle. Expired, but better than cabbage brine. Bandages, Band-Aids, small scissors. Dan treasured that first aid kit like gold. In the seventh house, he found tools. In the garage, under the workbench, in a welded-shut box. A hammer, pliers, a set of screwdrivers, a saw, a tape measure. Someone had cherished their tools and welded the box shut so looters couldn't get to them. The looters didn't bother with it. Dan spent an hour, but managed to pry it open, with a rock and a piece of rebar. He walked back loaded down. He had no backpack. He carried everything in his hands and in his jacket, tied in a knot. 4 hours there, 4 hours back. When he entered the warehouse perimeter, the system welcomed him back like a home welcomes its owner. A warm wave washed over his body. He felt the building again. Marcus met him at the gate. His face was tense. He said that while Dan was gone, someone had come by. One man. He stood on the road and looked at the warehouse for about 20 minutes. Then he left. Marcus described him. Tall, skinny, in a long coat, with something on his back, maybe a backpack, maybe a weapon. Dan listened. He asked which way he had gone. Marcus pointed north toward the forest. Dan made a mental note. Then he laid out the loot. 5 cans of stew, a first aid kit, tools. The system updated the data. Total calorie supply, 41,200. Autonomy for 3 people, 23 days. Tools added to the inventory. Medicines added to the registry. New task available. Set up a medical station. Requirements. Bandages. Antiseptic. A separate, clean room. Dan looked at the storage area. A separate room. There was one large open space here. A partition was needed. He took the tools and got to work. Using shelving units and sheets of metal, he partitioned off a corner. 3 by 2 meters, 6 square meters. He hung a piece of fabric in place of a door. He wiped the floor 3 times, with water and antiseptic. He laid a clean cloth on the floor. He placed a first aid kit on the shelf. Bandages, antiseptic, scissors. Everything in its place. The system confirmed it. The medical station was equipped. Level 0, basic. The right place effect was working. Wounds treated in this room heal 15% faster. Dan immediately took Marcus there, sat him down, removed the old bandage. He washed the wound with real antiseptic, applied a clean bandage. Marcus sat quietly. Then he said that Dan was a strange man, that anyone else in his place would have taken the first aid kit for himself in case of injury. But Dan's first move was to treat someone else. Dan shrugged. He said that a first aid kit on a shelf doesn't heal. It heals when it's on the wound. Marcus looked at him for a long time. Then he asked who he was. Dan said he was the shift supervisor. Former. Marcus didn't understand. The next few days were spent working. Dan divided the greenhouse into sections. Potatoes in the center, Around the edges, he planted wild onions he'd found in the field behind the warehouse. The system counted them as a crop. The growth bonus spread. Tommy turned out to be a good worker, quiet, attentive. He did what he was told and didn't complain. His scurvy was receding. His gums turned from dark red to pink. His teeth grew stronger. The number above his head changed every day. 41, 60, 90, 120. Every bowl of cabbage added to his life. Dan couldn't get used to it. He watched the numbers move, and every time, something inside him tightened, because he also saw that the numbers could go down. When Marcus missed a dressing one day, the mark dropped by 3 days. 3 days for one missed dressing. Dan wouldn't let him miss any more. On the 14th day since Dan had woken up, people appeared on the road. 4 of them. A man, a woman, 2 children. A boy of about 10, a girl of about 7. They were walking slowly. The woman was limping. The man was carrying the boy in his arms. The boy wasn't moving. Dan saw them from the roof. He went down. He went out to the road. When they got closer, the system displayed the markers. Man, 90 days. Woman, 44 days. The boy in his father's arms, 12 days. The girl, 61 days. 12 days. The boy had 12 days left to live. Dan looked at the child. Pale, dry lips, eyes closed, fever. It was obvious without any system. The man stopped in front of Dan. His face was gray with exhaustion. He said they were from Birchwood. The town had fallen 3 weeks ago. They were heading north. The boy was unwell. He asked if there was any water here. Dan didn't answer the question. He told the man to carry the boy inside. Now, quickly, to the medical station. He walked ahead and opened the doors. Marcus jumped up. Tommy ran to get water. Dan laid the boy down on a clean cloth in the medical station. His forehead was hot. His breathing was rapid and shallow. The system showed 3rd-degree dehydration, early stage of sepsis, infected wound on the right foot. Dan cleaned the wound. Antiseptic, clean bandage, a spoonful of water every 10 minutes, not much at a time. His stomach won't handle it. Cabbage brine diluted with water 1 to 5. Electrolytes, vitamin C, lactic acid. He did all this in silence, precisely, like clockwork, step by step. The woman stood to the side and wept silently. The girl held her mother's hand and looked at Dan with wide eyes. The man sat down on the floor against the wall and covered his face with his hands. 4 hours later, the boy's temperature began to drop. 6 hours later, he opened his eyes and asked for a drink. Dan gave him water, just a little, 3 sips. 8 hours later, the mark above the boy's head changed. 12 days became 30. It wasn't much, but it was more than 12. The man's name was Reed Campbell. The woman's was Alice. The boy's was Owen. The girl's was Nora. Reed sat next to Dan by the fire at night after the children had fallen asleep and quietly asked how much he owed for this. Dan said nothing. Reed didn't believe him. He said that nothing in this world comes for free. Dan said he wasn't selling. He was just keeping it safe. Then he paused and added that if Reed wanted to repay him, he should stay. There was work here. They needed hands. Reed knew how to do something. Reed said that before the silence, he had been an electrician. Dan smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. A real smile. An electrician. In a world where there was no electricity, but where there were wires, there are generators, there are dynamos, there is a system that will soon require energy for the next modules. Reed stayed. Alice stayed. The children stayed. There were now 7 people in the warehouse. The system updated. 7 people on the premises. Autonomy at current consumption, 14 days. Recommendation to increase food production. New task. Ensure a stable diet for at least 10 people for 30 days. Reward. A cold storage module. 10 people. Dan needed 3 more. He didn't know where they would come from, but he knew they would come because the world outside the walls was dying, and people were going where they wouldn't die. And here, they hadn't died yet. That evening, Dan stood on the roof and looked out at the road. Far to the south, a fire was burning, a big one, not a campfire, a fire. Someone was burning something, or someone. Dan looked at that orange spot on the horizon and realized the scale of it for the first time. The world hadn't just broken down. The world was burning. Slowly, quietly, methodically. And those who survived this fire were walking the roads in search of a place to stop. And he stood on the roof of a warehouse with 12 cans of stew, a patch of potatoes, and a makeshift medical station out of tin and shelving. And the system told him that this was enough, that this was the beginning, that he just had to keep going. He went downstairs, checked the cabbage, he checked the water, he checked on the boy, marked 32 days, 2 more than this morning. Every liter, every spoonful, every bandage. Reed Campbell turned out to be the man Dan needed most of all. An electrician with 12 years of experience, hands that remembered every wire, a mind that saw circuits where others saw junk. On the 3rd day after his arrival, Reed took apart the generator from the bus on the road. The generator was dead. The windings had rotted, the brushes were... But the casing was intact, and the bearings were still turning. Reed said that if they could find some copper wire, he could rewind it. Dan asked the system. For the first time, he turned to it not as a to-do list, but as a reference guide. The system replied, found within a 3-kilometer radius of the warehouse, 14 pieces of equipment with copper windings. The closest one, a transformer box at the intersection. Distance, 1 kilometer, 200 meters. Direction, southwest. Dan sent Marcus and Reed out, with tools, with a specific list, copper wire, the more, the better, insulation, connectors, anything that looks like electrical stuff. They returned 5 hours later with 2 coils of copper wire and a bag of odds and ends. Reed was glowing, not with joy, from excitement. He said the transformer box was a gold mine. There's more there. Dan nodded, jotted it down in his notebook. He had a notebook now, a notebook from the dead town. Half the pages were covered in someone's prescriptions. The other half was blank. Dan kept track by hand, every day. Calories in, calories out. Water, medications, tools, people, their condition, their tags. He wrote the last one down in a separate column. No one knew what those numbers meant. Dan said they were health data, that the system showed him their overall condition. He wasn't lying. He just wasn't telling the whole story. While Reed worked on the generator, Dan tackled another problem. Food. 14 days worth for 7 people. That wasn't enough. Potatoes were growing in the greenhouse, but 57 days is 57 days. There were 4 cans of stew left. The peas were running out. The cabbage was disappearing fast. They needed another source. Dan went outside the perimeter and headed toward the forest to the northeast. The forest looked sick. Half the trees were leafless. The bark was gray and dry. But the other half was alive, green, stubborn. Under the trees, Dan found mushrooms, small, brown. He wasn't a mycologist. He didn't know which ones were edible. The system helped. Locking onto target. Mushroom. Species undetermined. Toxicity undetermined. Recommendation: do not consume. Useless. He walked on. Found a hazel bush, dead. Found a stream, shallow, barely alive, but with water. The water was cleaner than rainwater. The system confirmed it. Water source detected, stream. Flow rate approximately 200 liters per day. Quality acceptable after filtration. Distance from the warehouse, 800 meters. That was far. 800 meters one way with canisters. But it was water, a stable supply, not dependent on rain. Dan returned and organized a route. Every day, Tommy and Reed went to the stream and brought back 20 liters each. 40 liters a day. For 7 people, that's a little over 5 liters each. Normal. Near the stream, Dan noticed tracks. Not animal tracks, human, fresh. 1 person. Heavy boots, long stride. That same stranger in the raincoat. Dan remembered. On the 18th day after waking up, two things happened at once. In the morning, Reed finished the generator. Small, homemade, it ran on pedals, like an exercise bike. You turn the pedals and a copper coil spins inside the magnets that Reed had taken from speakers in the dead town. It didn't produce much, but enough to light a bulb. One. A small one, a car bulb, 12 volts. Reed hooked it up that evening. All 7 of them stood in the warehouse and watched as the light bulb lit up. A yellow, uneven light, flickering, dim, but it was light, electric light, for the first time in a very long time for those who lived in this world. Nora, that very same 7-year-old girl, stood and stared in awe. Then she asked her mother what it was. Alice said it was electricity. Nora didn't understand. She was born after the silence. She had never seen electric light. Dan stood to the side and watched the girl who was watching the light bulb, and he thought that for this moment alone, it had been worth fixing the roof and washing the wounds and counting calories. The system has been recorded. Power restored. Level 0. Pedal generator. Minimum power. Module available for unlocking. Generator level 1. Task required. Ensure stable lighting for 14 days. The second event occurred in the afternoon. A convoy pulled up to the warehouse. 3 vehicles. Old SUVs converted to diesel. Judging by the sound, the engines were running on something homemade. Maybe biodiesel. Maybe oil. 4 armed men got out of the first vehicle. Assault rifles, body armor, helmets, professionals. A woman in clean clothes got out of the second vehicle. Clean. In this world, that meant more than weapons. Clean clothes meant resources. Water, soap, time to do laundry, a luxury. The woman was of Asian descent, short, short-haired, a stern face. Behind her stood a large, silent man with a rifle slung over his shoulder. They stopped 30 meters from the gate, right on the perimeter line, as if they knew. The woman said loudly that she was speaking on behalf of Colonel Drake, the commander of Fort Camden, that the colonel had heard about the new settlement in the valley, that the colonel was offering friendship and protection. Dan went out to meet them, alone, unarmed. He didn't have a weapon. Marcus's sawed-off didn't count. He stood before 4 men with automatic rifles and a woman in clean clothes and thought he probably should be afraid. But fear didn't come. Instead of fear, there was arithmetic. 3 vehicles, fuel consumption, 4 soldiers with assault rifles, supplies, ammunition, food, logistics. If Fort Camden is sending a convoy like this on a reconnaissance mission, that means they have resources. But if they came to offer friendship, that means they want something. Otherwise, they would have just taken it. The woman introduced herself. Min-so Cho, captain of Fort Camden. She looked at Dan appraisingly, then at the warehouse, then at the greenhouse on the south side, then back at Dan. She asked how many men he had. Dan said 7. Min-so didn't hide her surprise. 7 men, a greenhouse, a working gate, a medical station, a generator. All of this in 3 weeks with 7 people. She said that Colonel Drake was offering a standard agreement. Fort Camden would provide protection from the Reapers and other threats. In exchange, 60% of the produced goods would be handed over to the fort. Dan listened. Then he said no. Just no. Min-so narrowed her eyes. She asked if he understood he realized that the Reapers would find this place sooner or later. That 7 unarmed people weren't a settlement, but a target. That Colonel Drake wasn't used to hearing no. Dan said that 60% meant death. If they gave up 60% of the harvest, the remaining 40 wouldn't be enough to survive the winter. And Drake knew that. And she knew that. And all 4 of them with the assault rifles knew that. 60% isn't protection. It's a takeover with a smile. Min-so was silent. Dan saw her mark. Numbers glowed above her head. 412 days. Over a year. She was healthy, strong, well-fed. 412 days is a long time by this world's standards. But for a 31-year-old woman in her prime, it's still a death sentence. A normal person her age should live 1,000 days. Here, 412 was considered a blessing. Dan didn't tell her that. He said something else. He said that if Colonel Drake wanted cooperation, he should send a carpenter instead of machine gunners, or a blacksmith, or a teacher. Let him send someone who knows how to do something other than shoot. And then they'd talk. Not about percentages, about work. Minso looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and walked to the car. She got in. The convoy drove off. Marcus approached Dan from behind. He asked if he'd lost his mind. Dan replied that he hadn't. He'd just done the math. Marcus asked what exactly he'd calculated. Dan said that if they'd wanted to take it by force, they would have. They wouldn't have bothered talking. So Drake was watching for now, thinking it over. And while he was thinking, they had time. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He lay on the floor and stared into the darkness. The light was off. No one was pedaling. In the darkness, he thought about the numbers. 7 people, 14 days' worth of food, 1 pedal-powered generator, 1 greenhouse, 1 medical station. And somewhere out there, Colonel Drake with his army. And somewhere, the collectors. And somewhere out there, that man in the raincoat who was watching. The system pulsed quietly in the background. Warehouse number 0. Status stable. 7 inhabitants. 13 days of autonomy. Recommendation, do not slow down. Dan closed his eyes. 13 days. In 13 days, the food will run out if he doesn't find a new source. In 57 days, there will be potatoes. Between the 13th and the 57th day, there is a 44-day gap that cannot be filled. 44 days without food meant death. He lay there and counted, as always, just like his whole life. Because counting was the only thing he knew how to do really well. And because in this world, numbers didn't lie. They simply showed the truth, beautiful or not. Dan didn't solve the problem like a hero. He solved it like a warehouse manager. On the 19th day, he sat down with a notebook and laid it all out. Calorie sources, consumption, deficit, options. Potatoes would be ready in 40 days. The greenhouse accelerated growth. Cabbage would run out in 8 days. Canned meat in 4. The peas ran out yesterday. All that remained was wild onions from the greenhouse. Few calories, almost none, but vitamins. He needed protein. He needed fat. Plant sources won't provide enough of that in the time needed, so animal protein is needed. Fish. Dan remembered the stream. Small, weak, but alive. Where there's water, there might be fish. He went to the stream in the morning, alone. He sat on the bank and watched, for a long time, 40 minutes. The water was clear, shallow. The stones on the bottom were covered with a green film, algae, alive. Where there's algae, there's an ecosystem. Where there's an ecosystem, there's a food chain. He saw them an hour later, small shadows near the bottom. Fish. Small, about 10 centimeters, but fish. He didn't know how to fish. He'd never fished in his life. His father hadn't taught him. His friends hadn't invited him. At the warehouse, the fish arrived in frozen blocks, and he didn't need to know where it came from. Now he did. Dan went back to the warehouse and put together a trap. From a tin can with holes, the principle of a funnel. The fish goes in through the funnel-shaped entrance, but can't get out. He'd seen it in a documentary 10 years ago. He set the trap in the stream. He checked it in the evening. 3 fish, small ones, 30 grams each, 90 grams of fish, about 80 calories. For 7 people, that's nothing. But Dan wasn't discouraged, because 3 fish is proof of concept. There are fish. The trap works. We need to scale it up. The next day, he made 5 traps. He set them up along the stream every 20 meters. On the 21st day, in the evening, there were 22 fish in the 5 traps, about 600 grams, 500 calories. Still not enough, but it's not 0 anymore. Reed suggested an idea. He said that 200 meters down the stream, there's a spot where the water widens into a small pond. If we set up a wire mesh, we could create a fish trap. Catch fish and don't eat them right away, but save them up, so they'd grow. Dan looked at him and said that was the mindset of a logistics guy. Reed replied that it was the mindset of a man who wanted to eat. They built the fish trap in 2 days. Wire mesh from a transformer box, stakes made of branches. Primitive, but it worked. The fish got into the fish trap and stayed there. A week later, there were about 40 fish swimming in the trap. Some had grown. The stream fed them algae and small creatures. The system recorded it. Protein source detected. Fish farm level 0. Current productivity is approximately 400 calories per day. Recommendation: expand. 400 calories per day. For 7 people, that's 57 calories each, about 1 fish. Not enough to fill you up, but with potatoes and cabbage and wild onions, that's already a diet. Meager, hungry, but a diet. Dan did the math. Cabbage plus onions plus fish plus the leftover stew would yield about 1,100 calories per person per day. The minimum for survival is 1,200, a deficit of 100 calories. But if he cut his portion by 200, the other 6 would get 1,230 each. That would be enough. Dan started eating less. He didn't tell anyone. He just took a smaller portion. He explained that he wasn't hungry, that he'd eaten in the morning, that it was enough for him. Marcus noticed on the 3rd day. He didn't say anything. He just put his fish on Dan's plate when Dan turned away. Dan noticed and looked at Marcus. Marcus was staring at the wall and pretending nothing had happened. Dan ate the fish. He didn't argue, because arguing with Marcus was pointless. On the 23rd day, more people arrived. 3 of them, 2 men and an old man. The men were young and angry. The old man could barely walk. They weren't a family. They'd just been traveling the same road and had stuck together. The men's names were Carl and Jensen. The old man was Abraham. Carl was big, broad, with tattoos on his arms, a former construction worker. Jensen was skinny and nervous, a former auto mechanic. Abraham said nothing about himself, only that he was 68 and that he was tired. The system displayed the tags. Carl, 201 days. Jensen, 173. Abraham, 39 days. Dan let all 3 in, fed them fish, onions, cabbage brine. Abraham ate slowly. His hands were shaking. He held the spoon with both hands. Dan looked at him and saw 39 days, a little over a month. The old man was dying, not from any one specific illness, from everything at once, from exhaustion, from hunger, from age, from a world that killed the old first. Dan took him to the medical station, laid him down, gave him clean water, warm water. He now heated water over a fire in an iron barrel and kept it in a canister wrapped in rags. Warm water was medicine too, for a man who for months had drunk nothing but dirty, icy slush from puddles. Abraham lay there and stared at ceiling. Then he said quietly that he had been a pianist, a long time ago, in another life. He had played in an orchestra in Salt Lake City. Beethoven, Chopin, Debussy. Then silence. Then 8 years. Then the road. Dan listened and nodded. Then he asked if Abraham could teach. Could he tell the children about music? Abraham looked at him strangely. He said he had no instrument, no sheet music, nothing. Dan said an instrument wasn't needed yet. What was needed was a voice and a memory. Nora, that very same 7-year-old girl, had never heard music. Not once. She was born after the silence. She doesn't know what a melody is. If Abraham could at least sing or hum or describe it, that would be better than nothing. Abraham was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd try. The next evening, it was quiet in the warehouse. 10 people: Dan, Marcus, Tommy, Reed, Alice, Owen, Nora, Carl, Jensen, Abraham. They sat around a fire in an iron barrel. A light bulb glowed with a warm yellow light. Reed turned the pedals. And Abraham sang, softly, hoarsely. His voice was old and frail, but there was a melody, something by Schubert, a lullaby. Nora sat on her mother's lap and listened, motionless. Her eyes were huge, her mouth slightly open. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her responded to these sounds, something ancient, human, something that even silence hadn't killed. Dan sat against the wall and watched them all. At Marcus, who was wiping his eyes with his sleeve and pretending it was smoke. At Alice, who was holding both children close. At Carl, who was clenching his huge tattooed fists and staring into the fire. At Tommy, who was smiling for the first time in 3 weeks. 10 people. The system flashed silently. Task updated. Provide a stable diet for at least 10 people for 30 days. Status in progress. Today is the first of 30. 30 days. Dan had to feed 10 people for 30 days. With fish and potatoes that hadn't grown yet, with cabbage that was running out, with onions that were scarce. 1,100 calories per person, 100 below the norm, plus his own ration, cut down to 900. Every day would be a struggle. Every day he would be counting, reallocating, saving, like in a warehouse, like his whole life. Only now, the stakes weren't invoices or a bonus at the end of the quarter. The stakes were the marks above their heads. 10 marks, 10 countdowns. And every day he had to make sure the numbers went up, not down. On the 25th day, Dan expanded the greenhouse. The system allowed him to increase the area to 60 square meters after he completed an intermediate task. The task was strange. Not to build, not to find, but to teach. The system required Dan to pass on the skill of caring for the plants to at least 2 people, so they could work without his direct supervision. He chose Tommy and Alice. For 3 days he showed them how to water, how much water per square meter, when to loosen the soil, how to tell if a plant isn't getting enough light, how to tell a healthy sprout from a sick one. Tommy picked it up quickly. Alice was slower but more thoughtful. She asked questions, the right ones, precise ones. Why exactly that much water? Why in the morning and not in the evening? Dan answered, patiently, in detail, just as he answered the interns in the warehouse, without condescension, as an equal. The system confirmed it. The skill was passed on. The greenhouse was expanded. The new area was 60 square meters, a recommendation to diversify the crops. Dan planted everything he could find: wild onions, sorrel from the field, dandelions, roots that looked like something edible and that the system confirmed as safe. Not a vegetable garden, more like a guerrilla garden, but every calorie counts. On the 27th day, Carl came to him and said he wanted to build a wall. Dan asked what kind of wall. Carl said all around the warehouse, around the greenhouse, around everything, because sooner or later someone would come, and not with questions. Dan thought about it for 2 days. A wall means resources, time, strength, calories that would be spent on hard physical labor, calories that were already in short supply. But Carl was right. An open warehouse with a greenhouse in plain sight was an invitation. To the gatherers, to looters, to anyone who was hungry and armed. Dan agreed, but he set a condition. The wall would not be made of stone, not concrete. There aren't enough resources for that. The wall would be made of earth. An earthwork, a moat and a rampart, like in ancient times. Earth is free. All it takes is hands and time. Carl smirked. He said he was a builder, not an archaeologist. But he started digging. Marcus helped. Jensen helped. Even Reed came in the evenings after his bike rides and dug. Dan did the math. The perimeter around the warehouse, the greenhouse, and the medical post was about 200 meters. A moat 1 meter deep and 1.5 meters wide. A rampart 1 meter high made of the excavated earth. The volume of work was about 300 cubic meters of earth. At the current pace and with the number of workers, that would take 45 days. A long time. But the process was moving forward. Every day the trench grew 4 or 5 meters longer. Every day the embankment grew taller. And every day the system expanded the perimeter just a little. When the trench reached 20 meters from the warehouse wall, the system flashed. Territory expanded. The radius of effect has increased. The effect of the right place now covers not 30 meters, but 35. Dan understood. The system was growing along with them. The larger the territory they were developing, the farther its control reached. This meant that the wall was not just protection, The wall was growth. On the 30th day, exactly 1 month since they'd awakened, Dan stood on the warehouse roof and looked down. 10 people. The greenhouse was green. A light bulb glowed in the window. Smoke drifted from a pipe into an iron barrel. A moat and a rampart were growing around the warehouse. A fish tank stood by the stream. The infirmary was clean and warm. Abraham sat on a bench that Carl had knocked together and was telling Nora and Owen about what an orchestra was. The children listened. The tags. Dan could see them all from here. Marcus, 340. Tommy, 270. Reed, 400. Alice, 210. Owen, 120. Nora, 205. Carl, 230. Jensen, 190. Abraham, 51. 51. It was 39. Now it's 51. 12 days in a month. Not much, but heading in the right direction. Up. Always up. The system showed the month's results. Warehouse number 0. Status stable. Population 10. Autonomy 26 days. Unlocked modules. Basic roof repair. Passive temperature control. Greenhouse level 1. Basic medical station. Power supply level 0. Current tasks. Provide rations for 10 people. 21 days remaining. Complete perimeter fencing. Next available module. Cold storage. Dan read it all. He nodded. He went downstairs. He walked over to the fire. Someone had placed a bowl of fish soup in front of him. Fish, wild onions, and sorrel. Hot. Dan ate and thought that a month ago he had died in a parking lot in Chicago. And now he was eating fish soup in a world with a gray sky among 10 people he hadn't known 30 days ago, and whom he now couldn't imagine losing. Because he knew their marks, knew how much time they had left, knew that every bowl of this soup added a day to one of them, or 2, or an hour, and that it was enough to get up tomorrow and start counting again. On the 32nd day, a woman approached the gates of the valley, alone, with a backpack that was bigger than she was, thin, wearing glasses with a cracked left lens. Her hair was black and short, dirty. Her jacket was torn at the elbow. Her boots were worn down to the white on the toes. She stood by the ditch and looked at the greenhouse, not at the gate, not at the walls, at the greenhouse. Marcus called out to her from the wall. He asked who she was and what she wanted. She didn't answer him. She was looking at the greenery behind the greenhouse's wire fence, and her lips were moving, as if she were counting, or as if she didn't believe it. Dan went out to her. The system showed a mark. 162 days. Not critical, but not good either. For a 26-year-old woman, 162 days was not enough. She looked at him, and the first thing she said wasn't a request for food or water. She asked what kind of substrate he had in the greenhouse. Dan didn't understand the question right away. She repeated it. Substrate. Potting mix. What does plants grow in? What's in it? What's the pH? How's the drainage? Dan said it was dirt. Just dirt from the field. Clayey. Heavy. She closed her eyes. Opened them. Said he was wasting half his potential. That clay soil holds water and the roots suffocate. That he needed sand for drainage, compost for nutrients, and ash for potassium. That without the right growing medium, his potatoes would yield at most 60% of their potential harvest. Dan looked at her. Then he said that the gate is open, that there's food and water inside, and that if she knows how to do better, she should show him. Her name was Yuna Khan, a former agricultural engineer. Before the silence, she had worked on vertical farms at a research center. 10 years. For 10 years, she had designed systems that could feed thousands of people within a few square meters. Then the world ended, and her lab burned down, along with all the data, prototypes, and samples. She had walked across half the continent. Her backpack weighed 22 kilograms. Almost all of that weight was seeds. Tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, beans, carrots, spinach, basil, radishes. Every packet was labeled. Every packet was stored in a zip-top bag inside another zip-top bag inside a plastic container. 3 layers of protection. She hauled those seeds through rain and heat and looters and hunger. She lost everything else: clothes, shoes, food, water. But she saved the seeds. When Dan opened her backpack and saw the contents, he was silent for a long time. Then he asked how many varieties there were. Yuna said 23. 23 varieties of vegetables and greens adapted to low light and acidic soils. She had bred them herself, in the lab, before the silence. She had bred varieties for conditions that didn't yet exist. And then those conditions arrived, and the varieties turned out to be the only thing that made sense. Yuna had been working since the first hour. She didn't ask for permission, she didn't wait for instructions. She walked into the greenhouse and got to work, with her hands. She sifted through the soil, she sniffed it, she crumbled it between her fingers. Then she told Dan she needed sand from the stream, ash from the fire, and compost from food scraps. Everything that was rotting in the pit behind the warehouse. Everything they threw away. It's not trash, it's fertilizer. Dan organized it. Tommy hauled sand from the stream. Marcus gathered the ash. Alice started the compost pit following Yuna's instructions. 3 days later, Yuna transplanted the potatoes into the new substrate. Sand plus soil plus compost plus ash. The proportions were exact, down to the gram. She measured by eye, but her eye was more precise in any scale. 10 years of training. The system responded immediately. Greenhouse productivity increased. Expected potato yield, 34 kilograms. Time to harvest, 41 days. It had been 21 kilograms in 57 days. Now it was 34 in 41. Dan read the numbers and looked at Yuna. She was kneeling in the dirt. Her hands were dirty up to her elbows. Her glasses had slipped down her nose. The cracked glass glistened. She was looking at the potato sprouts, and on her face was an expression that Dan had only ever seen on his own. Recognition. She was home. Not in this warehouse, not in this world, but at work, in the soil, in the one thing she knew how to do, loved, and lived for. That evening, the two of them sat in the greenhouse. The others had gone to sleep. Yuna was planting tomatoes, tiny seeds, one by one, in holes she made with her finger. Precise, even, at equal distances. Dan sat next to her and held a lantern. Not a lantern. A light bulb on a cord from the generator. Reed had run the cord from the warehouse to the greenhouse. 10 meters. The light was yellow and dim, but it was enough. Yuna worked in silence. Then she said, without turning around, that he was strange. Dan asked, in what way exactly? She said that anyone else in his place would have built an armory or barracks or a higher wall, but he was building a greenhouse. Dan said that a wall doesn't feed anyone. Yuna said that a wall protects those who feed others. Dan thought for a moment and said she was right. But first, there had to be someone to protect and something to feed them. And then the wall. Yuna turned and looked at him, through the cracked glass, for a long time. Then she said she would stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because he was the first person in 8 years who knew what substrate was. Dan didn't know if it was a joke or not. Yuna wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. She just said that and went back to the tomatoes. On the 36th day, Dan did something for Yuna that he hadn't done for anyone else. He reconfigured the greenhouse. He asked the system to redesign the zone for a specific person. Not for potatoes, not for maximum yield, for Yuna. The system responded. Module personalization, linked to operator Yuna Han. Productivity bonus increased from 30% to 45%. The stranger's hands know better effect is further enhanced for this operator. Specialization, agronomy. Dan read it and nodded. There it was. Modules built for a specific person provided a powerful bonus. The system didn't encourage impersonal production. It encouraged attention to the individual. Yuna noticed the difference that very same day. She said the soil seemed to have become more responsive, that the seeds were settling more evenly, that the water was draining into the soil at the right rate. She didn't know about the system. Dan hadn't told her, but she could feel it. On the 38th day, a girl arrived. Marcus and Tommy had brought her. They had gone on a reconnaissance mission to the dead town and found her in the basement of one of the houses. She was hiding. From whom, they didn't understand. She was 22 years old. Her light hair was dirty and tangled. Her face was scraped. Her right hand was bandaged with a rag. Marcus said she called herself Sarah and that her father was with her. Dan went out to meet them. He saw Sarah. He saw the man standing next to her, a big man with a bandaged leg, his face gray with pain. And he recognized him. It was the older of the two looters, the one who had come to the warehouse with a sawed-off shotgun during the first week. Only now did Dan see his mark. Marcus. 340 days. This wasn't that Marcus. This was a different man. His name was Ben Kowalski, Sarah's father, a former looter, the very one who had gangrene in his leg. Dan had treated him 3 weeks ago, washed the wound with cabbage brine, and Ben had left with Tommy. They both left 2 weeks later, at night, without warning. Dan thought they wouldn't come back, but Ben did come back, with his daughter, because his daughter was injured and he didn't know where else to go. Sarah Kowalski, the mark above her head. 381 days. She was in better shape than most, young, strong, but the wound on her arm was bad, a deep knife cut, inflamed. Dan took her to the medical station. He washed it out, treated it, bandaged it. Sarah sat quietly and watched his hands. Then she said he was doing it wrong, that the bandage shouldn't be applied that way, that he needed to drain the wound first and then cover it. That she knew because she was studying to be a medic, 1 year until graduation. Then silence. Dan stopped, looked at her, asked her to show him how to do it right. Sarah showed him. She rewrapped the bandage herself, with one hand, her left, precisely and carefully. Dan watched and thought that the system had once again brought him the right person. Not a warrior, not a hunter, a medic. The next day, Dan did 2 things. First, he asked the system to expand the medical station from 6 square meters to 15. He added a second partition, set up a second stretcher, a shelf for medicines, a kettle made from a tin can and wire over coals. Primitive, but it worked. Boiled water for sterilizing instruments. Second, he found a piece of sheet metal, flat, smooth. He scratched letters into it with a nail. Dr. Kowalski. He hung it at the entrance to the medical post. Sarah stood there looking at the sign for a long time. Then she said she wasn't a doctor, that she didn't have a degree, that she wasn't qualified. Dan said no one here would give her a degree. But the people she saved would be worth more than that. Sarah blinked. She turned away. Dan saw that her eyes had turned red. He didn't say anything. He just walked away. There was no time to wait. The greenhouse needed watering. The cages by the stream needed checking. On the wall, Carl was waiting with the question of where to dig next. The system had been updated. The medical station improved. Level 1, assigned to operator Sarah Kowalski. Healing bonus increased from 15 to 25%. Specialization, field medicine. 12 people in the warehouse. 38 days since waking up. Autonomy at current consumption, 19 days. 35 days until the potato harvest. The gap between food and harvest has shrunk to 16 days. Fish covered part of it. Sorrel and onions covered part of it. A shortage remained, but less than before. And Una had already planted tomatoes, beans, and spinach. Spinach grows fast. 25 days until the first harvest. Beans take longer. Tomatoes even longer. But the spinach would fill part of the gap. Una knew this. She was just as good at math as Dan, just in different units. He in calories, she in grams of nitrogen and phosphorus per square meter. On the evening of the 40th day, Dan sat by the fire and wrote in his notebook. 12 people. Names, tags, skills. Each person was a row in a table. Not because Dan saw them as rows, but because the table helped him see the whole picture. Who's missing? Where the gap is? What skill is needed next? Security, Marcus and Carl. Food production, Una, Tommy, and Alice. Medicine, Sarah. Engineering, Reed. Construction, Carl and Jensen. Education, Abraham. Logistics, Dan. And then nothing. No intelligence, no diplomacy, no connection to the outside world. No information about what was happening beyond the view from the roof. He didn't know where the gatherers were. Didn't know what Fort Camden was doing after the refusal. Didn't know where that man in the raincoat had gone. He knew nothing. And that frightened him more than hunger. On the 43rd day, Dan heard the word gatherers for the first time. Not as a rumor, not as a distant fear, as concrete information. Jensen brought it. He had gone on a reconnaissance mission to the southern fork and met 2 drifters there. A man and a woman. Both were heading north. Both were in bad shape. Jensen brought them to the valley. The man's name was Paul. The woman's was Greta. They told their story. The canyon collectors were on the move, slowly, but they were moving. Their leader, a man nicknamed the Butcher, was gathering people. Not just a gang, an army, hundreds of people. They went from settlement to settlement. Not all of them looted. Some just took over. They came and said, "Now you're with us." Those who agreed lived. Those who didn't were killed or driven away. Paul said that the Butcher wasn't like a typical bandit. He was organized. His men obeyed without question. He had a system, not like Dan's, different, dark. Paul couldn't explain it more precisely. He just said that everything felt different around the Butcher, as if the air grew heavy, as if something inside is tightening. Fear. But not ordinary fear. Animal. Primitive. Dan listened and jotted it down in his notebook. The Butcher. The canyon collectors. The system. A different system. He thought about it all evening. If the Butcher has a system, that means he's a carrier too. So whoever gave him the ability, just as they gave it to Dan, only the ability is different. Dan builds. The Butcher takes. 2 poles, 2 approaches. Dan didn't believe in coincidences. Not after everything that had happened. Someone had placed them on the board like pieces. He didn't know why, but he knew that sooner or later their paths would cross. Paul and Greta were left. 14 people. The system updated the task. There were 9 days left to complete the 30-day ration for 10 people days left. But there were already 14 people. The system hadn't changed the conditions. 10 people, 30 days. It only counted the first 10. Dan fed the rest beyond the norm, from his own supplies, from fish, from whatever he could. On the 45th day, what Dan had been waiting for and fearing happened. Min-So Cho returned, alone. No escort, no machine gunners, on foot, with a rifle slung over her back and a backpack. She stood by the moat and looked at the wall that had grown over the past 2 weeks. The moat was deep. The rampart was solid. Carl knew his stuff. Min-So assessed it with a single glance. Dan went out to her. He asked where her escort was. Min-So said there was no escort. She had come on her own. Not on Drake's behalf, on her own. Dan waited. Min-So paused. Then she said that Drake hadn't taken his refusal well, that the colonel considered the valley a resource that would sooner or later become his, that he wasn't in a hurry yet because he had enough problems with the Commonwealth of St. Paul to the west, but once he dealt with them, he would return, with another offer, or without an offer at all. Dan asked why she was telling him this. Min-So said she was tired, simply that. 10 years in the army, 3 years in this world, 2 years with Drake. She followed orders, always, no questions asked. It was simple, understandable, safe. But then Drake sent her squad to clear out a small settlement that refused to pay. 6 people, 3 families, children. Min-So followed orders. They cleared out the settlement, didn't kill them, just took everything. Food, water, tools, blankets. They left empty walls and people inside. A week later, the settlement was dead. 6 people, 3 families, frozen to death. Minso found out about it a month later. She hadn't slept properly since. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he asked only one thing: whether she could teach others to shoot. Minso looked at him. She said yes. Dan said he needed someone to teach his people to defend themselves. Not to attack, to defend. Walls are useless if there's no one to stand behind them. Minso asked what she would get in return. Dan said a seat. Her seat. Not a position, not orders, a seat at the table, a mug with her name on it, and the right to say no to any order she deemed wrong. Minso was silent for a long time. Then she said he was a naive idiot. Dan didn't argue. She stayed. On the 47th day, Minso began training. Marcus, Carl, Jensen, Reed, even Tommy. She put them through their paces from morning until noon, unarmed. First, physical training, running, push-ups, stretching. Then tactics, how to move, how to hide, how to use a wall, how to stand guard without falling asleep. She was tough, cold. She spoke little, but every word was to the point. Marcus grumbled. Carl cursed. Jensen nearly fainted after the first run. But after a week, the results were there. Marcus learned to stand guard properly. Carl stopped stomping like an elephant. Jensen no longer fainted. Minso didn't praise anyone, but Dan could see she was surprised. The system was working. Inside the perimeter, they all learned faster. Skills came more easily. Their muscles ached but recovered overnight instead of taking 3 days. The effect of the right place. Minso didn't know about the system, but she noticed. She asked Dan why his people recovered so quickly. Dan said it was good food and sleep. Minso didn't believe him, but she didn't press the issue. On the 50th day, the system flashed. Mission accomplished. Rations for 10 people secured for 30 days. Module unlocked. Cold storage chamber. Dan stood there, reading the description. Cold storage chamber. A 2 by 3 meter area in the east corner of the basement. Constant temperature of +4 degrees. No electricity, no compressor. The system maintains the temperature through the right place effect. He went down to the basement. The very same basement where he had found cabbage and potatoes on the first day. The system illuminated the corner. Dan placed a stone there. The stone grew cold within a minute. He put his hand there. Cold, even, steady. 4 degrees. Just like in an industrial refrigerator. Only without electricity, without noise, without breakdowns. Just a cold corner in the basement of an abandoned warehouse in a world with a gray sky. Dan sat on the basement floor next to the cold chamber and thought that this was the true power of his system. Not magic, not explosions, not lightning bolts from his hands. A cold corner in the basement. A place where food doesn't spoil, where meat can sit for a week, where fish can be stored for 3 days instead of 1, where milk, if they ever managed to get some, it would stay fresh. He went upstairs and announced it, calmly, without fanfare. He said that now they had a refrigerator. The reaction was strange. Carl laughed. He thought it was a joke. Reed didn't believe him and went to check. Yuna nodded as if she'd expected it. Minso narrowed her eyes. Sarah ran to the basement and stood there for 5 minutes with her hands in the cold zone. Then she came back upstairs with her eyes full of something Dan couldn't name. Maybe hope. Maybe the realization that the world isn't completely broken. That somewhere, something still works. Even if it's incomprehensible. Even if it's inexplicable. But it works. Abraham was the last to go down to the basement. He stood there for a moment. Then he came back up and quietly told Dan that a long time ago, when he was young, his grandmother used to store milk in the well because the well was always 4 degrees, and that the world turned out to be round. Dan didn't understand what he meant, but he nodded. On the 52nd day, they harvested the first crop of spinach. Yuna cut the leaves in the morning, green, bright, lively. 4 kilograms from a small patch. Not much by the standards of the old world, a fortune by the standards of the new one. Yuna brought the spinach to the dining hall. The dining hall was just an area by the fire with benches that Carl had knocked together. 5 benches, 3 tables, a mug at every seat. Dan had insisted on it. Every person in the valley had their own mug, with a name, scratched into the tin with a nail, ugly, crooked, but everyone had their own. Yuna put the spinach on the table, and all 14 people stood and watched. Green, fresh, grown here, not found in the ruins, not taken from a dead person, grown. Yuna said that now they had vitamins A and K and iron and folic acid and calcium. Then she translated it into human language. She said that this meant that gums would stop bleeding and bones would get stronger and children would grow properly. Nora stood nearby and looked at the spinach. Then she asked if she could eat it. Yuna crouched down in front of her and gave her a leaf. Nora put it in her mouth. She chewed. She grimaced. She said it was bitter. Yuna said that next time she would grow tomatoes and then it would taste better. Nora asked what tomatoes were. Yuna looked at Dan. Dan looked at Yuna. They both thought the same thing. A 7-year-old girl doesn't know what tomatoes are. This world had taken even words away from the children. That evening, Yuna sat alone in the greenhouse. Dan came to check the watering and saw her. She was sitting on the ground with her back to the wall, looking at the tomato sprouts. 12 little green stems, each in its own hole, each reaching toward the dim light of the bulb. Dan sat down beside her, silently. Yuna didn't turn around. She said she used to have a greenhouse in the lab, a real one, computer-controlled, with humidity, light, and temperature sensors. With a drip irrigation system that worked with milliliter precision. 10 years of work. It all burned down in a single day. Dan was silent. Yuna said that when she was walking here with the seeds, she thought that no one needed her knowledge anymore, that everything she had learned was useless in a world where people kill for a can of peas, that she was an engineer without engineering, an agronomist without a lab, a scientist without science. Dan said one sentence. He said that what she would be doing here was exactly she was born to do, just in different surroundings. Yuna turned and looked at him. Then she turned back to the tomatoes. But Dan noticed that her shoulders had relaxed slightly, as if something she'd been holding inside for a very long time had let go a little. Winter came on the 60th day, not the calendar kind, the real thing. The temperature dropped overnight. It was 10 degrees in the evening, -2 in the morning. Dan woke up from the cold and ran straight to the greenhouse. The tomatoes were still standing, alive. The temperature inside the greenhouse was 2 degrees higher, 0 instead of -2. Not enough. Critically not enough. Tomatoes can withstand 0, but not for long. If the temperature continues to drop, they'll die. Yuna was already there, on her knees, checking every stem. Her face was white, not from the cold, from fear. She said they needed shelter, physical, plastic sheeting or glass, something to keep the heat inside. The system confirmed it. Recommendation: provide physical shelter for the greenhouse area. The risk of crop loss under current conditions is 60%. 60%. Dan stood there and did the math. Losing 60% of the crop meant losing people, a direct correlation. Every kilogram of food meant someone's days of life. He saw it literally, markers above their heads. He sent out 3 groups, Marcus and Carl to the ghost town, to look for glass, window glass, any kind. Jensen and Paul to the transformer shed and beyond, to look for polyethylene, plastic sheeting, tarpaulin. Reed stayed with the generator, extra light in the greenhouse. Light means heat. Not much, but at least something. Dan himself worked on site. He was building the frame. Out of pipes and rebar and wire, the skeleton of the future greenhouse. If they find glass, great. If not, at least frames for the plastic. Tommy helped. Alice helped. Even Nora hauled small pieces of wire. Marcus and Carl returned 6 hours later, with 4 window frames, intact, glass still in place. They found them at a school on the outskirts of town. The school had been looted, but no one had touched the windows on the 2nd floor. Too high for lazy looters. Jensen and Paul brought a roll of polyethylene. Dirty, old, but intact. They found it on a farm 3 kilometers to the west. The farm was dead. The fields were empty. The house had no roof. But that roll was lying in the barn. like a gift. By evening, the greenhouse was closed up. Glass frames on the south side, plastic sheeting on top and on the other sides. A frame made of pipes, crooked, ugly, but airtight. The temperature inside rose to 5 degrees. Yuna checked the tomatoes, alive. Potatoes, alive. Beans, alive. Spinach, alive. Everything was alive. Dan stood outside and looked at the structure. A greenhouse made of trash. Glass from the school in the dead town. Plastic sheeting from the dead farm. Pipes from the dead bus. Everything dead had become part of something alive. The system confirmed. Greenhouse upgraded. Level 2. Physical shelter installed. Temperature bonus increased. Productivity increased by 20%. New expected potato yield, 41 kilograms. Tomatoes, first harvest in 30 days. Beans, first harvest in 45 days. Dan read it and exhaled. 41 kilograms of potatoes. That's 30,000 calories. For 15 people, that's more than a month. If you add fish and greens and beans later, that's no longer survival. That's life. Meager, hard, but life. Winter was bearing down. Every day the temperature dropped another degree. By the 70th day, it was -8 outside. Inside the warehouse, it was +3. Inside the greenhouse, +6. The cold storage room was running as usual, +4. Irony. The cold storage room was warmer than the living quarters. People were freezing. There weren't enough blankets. There weren't enough clothes. Dan sent out search parties every day. Fabric, blankets, jackets, anything that could keep them warm. They found little. The dead town had been gutted. The distant territories were dangerous. Minso did not recommend going further than 5 kilometers. Beyond that radius, the unknown began. Other survivors, other groups, not all of them friendly. On the 72nd day, the first person in the valley died. Not from starvation. Dan would carry this with him for the rest of his life. Greta, the very woman Jensen had brought in from the southern road. She had tuberculosis, advanced, chronic. Sarah diagnosed it 2 days after Greta's arrival. But without antibiotics, without an x-ray, without anything, she could only relieve the symptoms. Greta coughed up blood for 3 weeks. She lost weight. She wasted away. Her vital signs dropped every day. Dan watched her and saw the numbers go down. 80, 60, 40, 20, 10, 3, 1, 0. She died at dawn, quietly. Sarah sat beside her and held her hand. When Greta stopped breathing, Sarah left the medical station and sat down on the ground, right in the snow. Dan walked over, sat down beside her. They sat in silence. Then Sarah said that if only she'd had antibiotics, if only she'd had proper equipment, if only. Dan said she'd done everything she could. Sarah said it wasn't enough. Dan didn't argue, because she was right. It wasn't enough. Greta was buried behind the embankment. Carl dug the grave. Abraham said a few words, quiet, simple, about how she was no longer walking the road, that she had reached her destination. 14 people stood around the grave and were silent. Then they dispersed. Work wouldn't wait. On the 75th day, Abraham died. Pneumonia. 3 days. From the first cough to the last breath. Sarah fought. Boiling water, inhalations from herbs that Yuna found in the forest, warm compresses. It was all in vain. 68 years old, a weakened body, the cold, malnutrition. The world killed the elderly first. Dan found out in the morning. He stood at the entrance to the medical post and looked at the empty bed. The monitor had gone to 0 during the night. He hadn't seen it. He had been asleep, and it was eating him up inside, that he had been asleep while the numbers dropped to 0. Then he did something he couldn't explain logically, something that made no sense in terms of calories, resources, and self-sufficiency. He remembered that Abraham was a pianist, that he used to tell the children about music, that Nora listened to him with her mouth agape, that there was a school in that dead little town, and there might be one at the school. Dan went to Marcus. He said he needed 8 men, strong ones, for 2 days. Marcus asked why. Dan said there was a piano in town, at the school. He did it when he was taking the window frames, out of tune, beaten up, but a piano. Marcus looked at him, then asked why they needed a piano. Dan said they needed it. They just needed it. Marcus didn't argue. 8 men, 2 days. They dragged the piano across the field, down the road, through the ditch, through the gate. 200 kilograms of dead wood and rusted strings and yellowed keys. It was madness, absolute madness, pointless from any practical standpoint. The calories spent transporting the piano could have been used to dig a ditch, to go fishing, to chop firewood, to do anything useful. The piano didn't provide calories. It didn't keep them warm. It didn't protect them. You couldn't eat it. Dan knew that. He knew better than anyone. He was a man who counted every unit, every gram, every step, and he had spent 16 man-days on the piano. When they dragged it into the warehouse and set it against the wall, Dan asked Nora to come over. The girl approached. She looked at the big wooden box with black and white keys. She pressed one. The sound was off-key, out of tune. A piano, 3 notes flat, in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of a dead world. But there was a sound, and Nora pressed another key, and another, and began to press with both hands. Random notes, chaotic, but she was smiling. For the first time in a long time, widely, with her teeth, like a child who had found something impossible. Dan stood and watched. Marcus stood behind him. Carl, Min-so, Yuna, Sarah. Everyone stood and watched the 7-year-old girl playing the broken piano. No one said a word. Then Dan quietly said that this was for Abraham, that the old man had wanted the children to know what music was, that he hadn't had time, but the piano is here, and someone will learn to play it, and then Abraham would be right. The system flashed. New object added to the registry, piano. Category, non-caloric resources. Subcategory, morality. Effect, settlement trust level increased, level 2. Dan read it. Morality. The system counted morality. The piano didn't provide calories, but it provided something else, something the system measured and accounted for, something without which people didn't just die, but stopped wanting to live. That evening, Min-so approached Dan. For the first time ever, she looked at him without squinting, without judgment, without coldness. She said he wasn't a naive idiot. She was wrong. Dan asked, "Then who is?" Min-so thought for a moment. Then she said she didn't know, but that in 10 years of service, she had never seen a commander who gambled people away on a piano and still came out ahead. Dan said he wasn't a commander. He was a storekeeper. Min-so almost smiled. Almost. On the 83rd day, Dan harvested his first real crop of potatoes, 43 kilograms. Yuna counted them and said that was 2 kilograms more than the system's forecast. Dan asked why. Yuna said it was because of the compost. She had found a way to enrich the soil with fish waste. Heads, bones, and guts rotted in a special pit with worms that Tommy raised in a box in the basement. The worms turned the waste into soil. The soil turned the waste into potatoes. The potatoes turned themselves into people. A closed cycle. Yuna called it a mini ecosystem. Dan called it warehouse logistics. Nothing gets thrown away. Everything is put to use. That evening they ate potatoes. Boiled, hot, with wild onions and a pinch of salt that Min-so brought from her backpack. She hoarded salt like gold. She measured it out by the gram. 14 people sat around the table and ate hot potatoes with salt. Nora ate and cried. She didn't understand why. The tears just flowed on their own. Hot food, salty, real, grown right here, from the earth, by the hands of the people standing nearby. Dan didn't eat. He sat and looked at the readings. They were all going up, every single one. Even Marcus, whom he had once treated with cabbage brine. 460. A year and a half of life under current conditions. A month ago, it was 340. Potatoes and spinach and fish and warmth were doing their job. The system recorded it. Food security level 1 achieved. The population is provided with a basic ration on a permanent basis. Module available for unlocking. Rainwater collection system level 2. Automatic. Dan unlocked it. Invisible gutters appeared on the warehouse roof, not physical ones. The water simply began to flow down properly, on its own. Every raindrop fell into the barrels. Collection efficiency rose from 12% to 54%. Reed saw this and quietly said, "That didn't happen." Dan shrugged. On the 85th day, Reed finished the second generator, a real one, not pedal-powered, water wheel-powered. He'd been building it for 3 weeks. A small wheel made of wood and sheet metal mounted on the stream. The flow was weak but steady. The wheel turned slowly, windings on the axle, magnets, wires. The output was slightly less than from the pedals, but constant, 24 hours a day, without tiring, without breaks. Reed ran a wire from the stream to the warehouse, 800 meters, copper, fin. The losses over such a distance were enormous. They reached 20%, but that 20% was enough for 2 light bulbs. 2. One in the warehouse, one in the greenhouse. Light 24 hours a day. Yuna said that round-the-clock light in the greenhouse would accelerate growth by another 10%. The system confirmed it. Power supply level 1. Constant source. Low power, but stable. New modules available. Radio communication. Repair bench. On the 88th day, a group of 11 people reached the valley. Refugees. From the fortress city in the southwest. The city was called Harper's Ridge. It fell. Not to the gatherers. From within. Starvation. Supplies ran out. People began killing each other over a can of corn. The walls that had protected them from the outside world became a prison. Those who managed to escape headed north. Because of the rumor. The valley. Warm water. Bread. Light. 11 people. Exhausted, sick. Among them, an old man carrying a child, a woman with empty eyes, a teenager without a right arm, a man who walked and muttered the same phrase over and over. Dan saw their marks. The shortest, 7 days. The old man, the longest, 102 days. The teenager. He opened the gate, all 11 of them, no questions asked, no conditions, as always. Minso stood nearby and said nothing. Then she quietly said that if he kept taking everyone in, soon there wouldn't be enough food for anyone. Dan said he knew. Minso asked what then. Dan said that then they needed more food, not fewer people. Minso called him naive again, but not an idiot. Progress. 25 people. Autonomy had dropped from 26 days to 14. A blow. But Dan had already done the math. 11 new people meant 11 new pairs of hands. Among them, a woman who could sew, a man who used to be a plumber, a teenager who had worked in a blacksmith shop until he lost his arm. Dan arranged them like merchandise on a shelf, a place for everyone, a task for each. The seamstress received fabric and thread from the dead town. She began sewing blankets from whatever she could find, from old curtains, from scraps she found, from sacks, ugly, warm, life-saving. A plumber named Grant looked at the water collection system and said it was disgusting. Dan agreed. Grant suggested digging a ditch from the stream to the warehouse, 800 meters. Insane. But if the ditch had a slope, the water would flow on its own. No buckets, no walking, by gravity. Dan did the math. The elevation difference between the stream and the warehouse was about 4 meters. Enough. A ditch 30 centimeters wide and 20 deep. The volume of work was about 50 cubic meters of earth. With 10 diggers, 2 weeks. Calories for digging. Water for the diggers. Food. It all added up. Just barely. But it added up. They started digging on the 90th day. Everyone who could hold a shovel dug for 2 hours a day. 10 people, 2 hours, 20 man-hours, 4 meters a day, 800 meters, 200 days. No, too long. Dan recalculated. He extended the shifts to 3 hours. He added 4 more people. 14 men, 3 hours, 6 meters a day, 133 days. Still too long. But winter doesn't last forever. When it warms up, the pace will pick up. Grant said that until the ditch is ready, we can lay clay pipes inside it. There's clay along the stream banks. Fire bake them over a campfire. Primitive, but better than bare earth that will erode. Dan agreed, added it to the plan. Making pipes, firing, laying. The system displayed a new task. Ensure a centralized water supply. Reward. Hydroponics module. Hydroponics. Yuna heard that word from Dan, and for the first time ever, he saw something resembling a glimmer on her face. She asked if he was serious. Dan said that's what the system says. Yuna said that hydroponics was vertical farming. It was her specialty. It was what she lived for. Dan said that then she had a reason to dig a trench. Yuna looked at him. Then she picked up a shovel. She, who in her entire life had never dug anything heavier than a seed bed. She lined up with Marcus and Carl and started digging. Dan stood and watched. Then he picked up a shovel himself. He was a manager, not a digger. But sometimes a manager has to line up. Not because it's efficient, but because people need to see that he isn't separate from them, that he isn't up above, that he's in the dirt, right there with them. Minso watched this from the wall and thought. On the 95th day, Minso came to Dan at night. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting in the corner he'd started calling the control room. A table made of planks, a notebook, a hand-drawn map, numbers, lines, arrows. Minso sat down across from him. She said she needed to tell him something. Dan waited. Minso said that the Commonwealth of St. Paul had begun to move. Their leader, a man Elijah Vance, had sent scouts east, 3 groups of 5. They were looking for the valley. Word had reached them. And Vance believed that any restoration of the old world was a sin, that the silence was sent from above, that those who tried to rebuild were insulting the will that had destroyed. Dan asked how she knew. Minso said she had contacts in Fort Camden. Not everyone there agrees with Drake. Some are passing on information. Drake knows about the Commonwealth and is biding his time for now. He hopes that Vance and the Valley will destroy each other and he'll get the leftovers. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. The Commonwealth, Vance, Scouts, the East. Then he looked at Minso. Her mark, 438. It had gone up during her time in the Valley. Food and warmth and peace had done their work. He said he needed her help. Real help. Not training for civilians. A defense plan. A real one. For 25 people, of whom at most 10 are combat ready. Against a group that could arrive at any moment. Minso nodded. She said she'd already thought about it. That the wall was good, but not enough. That they needed observation posts, at least 3, on the approaches. They needed an early warning system, signal fires, or ropes with cans, something. They needed an evacuation plan. If the wall fell, we need to know where to take people. We need an emergency exit. We need a cache. A place outside the valley where we can hide food and water in case of a siege. Dan listened and took notes. Minso spoke for half an hour, without stopping, clearly, structured, like at a military briefing. When she finished, Dan looked at his notes, 3 pages. Then he looked at her. He said he was glad she'd come that night. Minso didn't answer. She stood up and went to her post, to the wall, into the darkness. Dan was left alone in the control room. He looked at the map, at the numbers, at the names. 25 people, 25 marks, 25 lives that he counted every morning. And somewhere out there beyond the horizon, Reverend Vance was walking toward him with conviction in his voice and faith in his heart. And behind him, even further away, the butcher was gathering an army. And off to the side, Colonel Drake was waiting for everyone to weaken. 3 predators, 1 valley, and 1 storekeeper who had never won a single fight in his life. On the 100th day, Reed fixed the radio, an old one, a military model. They'd found it on a farm during one of their forays. The casing was dented, the antenna was broken, but the insides were intact. Reed rewound the coil, replaced the capacitor, soldered the contacts together from parts he'd found, hooked it up to the generator by the stream. They picked up the first signal at night, crackling, noise. Then a voice, distant, intermittent. Someone was transmitting coordinates, a frequency, a call sign. Fort Camden. Their radio service. They were broadcasting the weather forecast and a list of exchange rates. A can of corned beef, 5 9mm rounds, 1 can equals 5 rounds. A sack of flour, 20 rounds. A liter of clean water, 2 rounds. Dan listened and took notes. Bullets as currency. This world measured life by the ability to kill. It measured it by the ability to feed. 2 languages for 1 world. Reed tuned the frequency, found another one. St. Paul's Commonwealth. No exchange rates here, just a sermon. The voice was steady, calm, masculine. Reverend Vance. He spoke of humility, of how a seed planted in cursed soil yields cursed bread, of how true salvation lies not within walls but in faith. His voice was warm, soothing. Dan listened, and he felt uneasy. Not because Vance was saying anything scary, but because he spoke beautifully, convincingly. A man who believed every word he said. Reed found the 3rd frequency. Empty, just static. Then a short signal. 2 short, 1 long. A pause. 2 short, 1 long. Repeat. No voice, no words. Just a code. Minso listened and said it was a beacon. Someone was signaling their location, or looking for a connection. They couldn't determine the coordinates from the sound, but the direction was approximate, northeast, where the forest is, where the tracks of that man in the raincoat are. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. 3 frequencies, 3 forces, and a 4th, unknown, somewhere in the forest. On the 103rd day, Emily Carter arrived. She was 19 years old. She was carrying a boy of about 4 in her arms. The boy wasn't moving. His eyes were closed. His face was gray. Emily stood at the gate and didn't say a word. She just stood there. Marcus called for Dan. Dan came out. He looked at the girl. He looked at the boy. The boy's mark. 0. The zeros weren't flashing. They weren't pulsing. They just stood there. The boy was dead. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. The body was still warm, but that was from Emily's body, which was holding him close. Dan looked at Emily. Her reading. 89 days. Low. Very low for a 19-year-old. Not from illness, from exhaustion, and from something else. Something the system didn't measure in numbers. Dan walked over to her. He said quietly that the boy... Emily didn't let him finish. She knew. She'd known for a long time, maybe since this morning, maybe since last night, but she kept carrying him, because if she stopped and put him down, it would become true. And as long as he was in her arms, he was still her brother. Dan didn't say anything. He simply took the boy from her arms, gently, like handling a box with fragile contents. He carried him to the medical station, laid him on a clean cloth. Sarah came over, looked, closed the boy's eyes, covered him with the cloth. Emily stood at the entrance and watched. Then her legs buckled and she sat down on the ground. She didn't fall. She just sat down, as if she'd been switched off. Dan told Alice to bring water and food, warm potatoes, fish broth, a blanket. Emily didn't eat, didn't drink. She sat and stared at the wall for 2 days. Dan didn't go near her, didn't comfort her, didn't say everything would be okay. He just placed a bowl of food next to her every 4 hours, took it away untouched, put a new one down. On the 3rd day, Emily ate a spoonful of broth. On the 4th, 2 potatoes. On the 5th, she drank some water. On the 6th, she asked if there was any work here. Dan gave her a job in the kitchen. Simple, repetitive. Peeling potatoes, chopping onions, stirring the stew. Her hands were busy. Her mind could be silent. Emily worked, quietly, methodically. She didn't talk to anyone, but she worked. 2 weeks later, Dan gave her another task, keeping track of the children's meals. By this point, there were 5 children in the valley. Nora, Owen, and 3 from the group of refugees from Harper's Ridge. The children ate separately, more often, in smaller portions, with supplements that Una prepared specially: spinach, carrot juice, fish oil. Dan told Emily that the children were the most important thing they had, that every spoonful for every child had to be counted, that this was a responsibility he entrusted only to her. Emily looked at him. For the first time in 2 weeks, there was something other than emptiness. Not gratitude, not joy, understanding. She understood what he was doing, that he was giving her a reason to get up in the morning. Not comfort, not words, a reason. She nodded, took the notebook, and began to count, just like Dan, by the gram, by the calorie, by the name. Nora, Owen, Liam, Becca, Sam. 5 names, 5 marks that Emily didn't see but that Dan checked every morning. They were all going up. On the 110th day, the wall was finished. Carl drove the last stake into the last section of the moat and stood up straight. The moat was closed. The rampart was closed. The full perimeter, 210 meters. A moat 1 meter 20 deep. A rampart 1 meter high. On the inside, a wooden palisade made of logs they'd hauled from the forest for 2 weeks. Not a fortress, but a barrier. From the outside, it's clear that people live here who intend to stay. The system confirmed. Perimeter secured. Level 2. The valley's territory has been recorded. The radius of effect is 40 meters from the warehouse's outer wall. The right place effect extends to the entire fenced-in area, a new bonus. All structures and zones within the perimeter receive an additional preservation bonus. Wear is slowed. Corrosion is slowed. Dan could feel it, literally. The warehouse had become stronger. The walls had stopped getting wet. The cracks he had patched a month ago were holding. The metal was rusting more slowly. The wood wasn't rotting. It was as if the building had pulled itself together. Pulled itself together. It had become what it was meant to be. On the 112th day, the last key figure of the first year arrived. Rachel O'Brien, 34 years old, a former truck driver. She arrived. She didn't just come. She arrived. On a bicycle cobbled together from 3 different bikes, with a trailer made from a supermarket cart. In the cart were things she'd collected along the way: tools, canisters, ropes, 2 sacks of dried beans, a bottle of whiskey, an old road map. She stopped by the ditch. She looked at the wall. She looked at the greenhouse behind the wall. She looked at the smoke coming from the chimney. She looked at the child who peeked out from behind the gate, and she said loudly that if there was food and a roof here, she was in. Marcus asked what she was in for. Rachel said everything. Dan came out to her. He saw the cart. He saw its contents, the map. His eyes lingered on the map. Highways, routes, distances, cities, bridges, interchanges. For a former truck driver, it was work documentation. For Dan, it was strategic intelligence on the entire region. He asked where she had been. Rachel began to list them. Over the past year, she had passed through 14 settlements. 5 of them were already dead. 3 under the collectors, 2 under Drake, 1 under the Commonwealth, 3 independent but fading. She knew the roads. She knew where the bridges were intact and where they'd collapsed, where you could drive through and where there were roadblocks, where it was safe and where there were ambushes. Dan listened and took notes, page after page. Rachel talked for 2 hours, in a bass voice, loudly, swearing every other word. Then she fell silent. She looked at him and asked, "Well, it'll do." Dan said he needed a logistics chief for external routes, someone who knew the roads and could lead convoys for supplies. Rachel laughed. She said she'd been behind the wheel for 20 years, that she didn't have a steering wheel, but she had legs and a cart. Dan said that would be enough for now. Rachel drove into the valley on her 3-wheeled monster with a supermarket cart. Marcus helped her unload. 2 bags of beans went into the freezer, tools in the cupboard, canisters on the shelf. Rachel hid the bottle of whiskey under the bunk. Dan saw it. He didn't say anything. That evening he made her a mug, just like for everyone else, a tin one, with her name scratched into it. Ray. Not Rachel. Ray. That's what she called herself. He put the mug on the shelf in the dining room next to his own. Ray saw it. She looked at the mug. She looked at his mug next to it. She didn't say anything. She left. Later, Marcus told Dan that he'd seen Ray sitting alone in the garage. Dan asked which garage. Marcus pointed to the utility room by the gate that Jensen used as a workshop. Dan didn't go there. It wasn't his business. But the next morning, he noticed that Ray's mug was standing a little closer to his, by a centimeter. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe not. 28 people, day 112. Autonomy, 31 days. For the first time, autonomy had exceeded a month. The system displayed the overall status. Storage unit number 0. Condition, good. Modules unlocked. Basic roof repair. Passive temperature control. Greenhouse, level 2. Medical station, level 1. Power supply, level 1. Cold storage. Water collection, level 2. Perimeter, level 2. Basic radio communication. Current tasks. Ensure centralized water supply. Progress 31%. Next available modules. Repair bench, hydroponics, biogas generator. Dan read the list and thought that 4 months ago he had been lying on the cold concrete, staring at a hole in the roof. 12 cans of peas and a sack of potatoes. 1 person. 0 days of self-sufficiency. And now 28 people. A month's worth of food, walls, light, medicine, radio, and everything else still ahead. Water supply, hydroponics, a generator, a school, a blacksmith shop, everything. He stood on the roof in the cold wind and looked out over the valley. His creation, his building, his warehouse, his people. And he knew that soon he would have to pay for all of it, because 3 predators were already watching him, and the price for every day of peace was rising. On the 130th day, the ditch was ready. 800 meters from the stream to the warehouse. Clay pipes fired over campfires, laid with a 4-meter slope. Grant stood at the outlet end and waited. Everyone was waiting. Dan lifted the flap at the entrance. The water started flowing. At first, it was brown, dirty, with clay and sand. Then lighter, even lighter. 10 minutes later, clear water was flowing from the pipe, transparent, cold, alive. It poured into the stone reservoir that Carl had built in 3 days against the north wall of the warehouse. A 200-liter capacity, gravity-fed, no pump, no electricity, no effort, just water flowing because the ground was sloped just right. 28 people stood around and watched as the water filled the reservoir. Nora cupped her hands. She scooped up some water, took a sip, laughed. Alice hugged Grant. Grant, who had never hugged anyone before, stood stiff as a board, not knowing where to put his hands. The system confirmed. Centralized water supply secured. Module unlocked. Hydroponics. Una stood next to Dan, and he could see her lips trembling, not from the cold. Hydroponics. Her dream, her life, her 10 years of work that she had considered lost. Everything was coming back. In a different package, in different surroundings, but it was coming back. The system described the module. Hydroponics, level 1. Area, 20 square meters. Plants are grown in a nutrient solution without soil. The system automatically maintains nutrient concentration. Productivity is 4 times higher than a conventional greenhouse of the same size. Assigned to operator Una Han. Productivity bonus, 60%. 4 times higher. Dan reread it. 20 square meters of hydroponics equals 80 square meters of a conventional greenhouse. With Una's bonus, even more. That meant the valley could feed not 28 people, 50, 70, maybe 100. Una got started that very day. She marked out an area in the warehouse basement. They expanded the basement. Carl dug out an additional 10 square meters. Dan ran water from the reservoir through pipes. Reed hooked up the lights. 2 bulbs, around the clock. Una assembled the first hydroponic setup from whatever was available. Plastic bottles cut in half. Tubes made from found hoses. A solution of ash, fish waste, and river water. Primitive, rough. A far cry from her lab with computers. But the principle was the same: roots in water, nutrients in water, light from above. The plants didn't waste energy searching for water in the soil. All their energy went into growth. 2 weeks later, the first hydroponic lettuce sprouts were twice as tall as those in a regular greenhouse. Yuna stood before them, and her face was one Dan had never seen before. Open, alive, young, as if a layer she had been carrying for 8 years had been lifted from her. That evening, she came to him in the control room, on her own for the first time. Usually, he came to her in the greenhouse. She sat down on a stool. She was silent for a moment. Then she said he was right, that what she was doing here was what she was born to do, that the setting was different, but the essence was the same. She feeds people. She grows life. And that if it weren't for him, she'd still be walking down the road with a backpack full of seeds and hatred for the world that had taken her job away. Dan listened. Then he said that the backpack of seeds was the most valuable thing to enter the valley in all 4 months. More precious than canned meat, more valuable than the tools, more valuable than the radio. Because the canned meat runs out, but seeds produce new seeds. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked over, and for the first time she touched his hand. She simply placed her palm on top of his. For a second. Then she withdrew it and left. Dan sat and looked at his hand. Then he opened his notebook. He wrote down the daily figures: calories, water, firewood, patrols, as usual. His hands weren't shaking. Almost. On the 145th day, Commonwealth Scouts found the valley. Min-so spotted them first, 3 people on a hill 2 kilometers to the west. They stood and watched, half an hour. Then they left. Min-so said it was an advance patrol, that the main group would arrive in 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month. It depended on how quickly Vance could gather people. Dan called a council meeting, the first real council meeting. Min-so, Marcus, Yuna, Sarah, Ray, Carl, Reed. 8 people around the table in the control room. Dan spread out a map. He showed where the scouts had been. He showed the direction they'd come from. He showed where, according to Ray, the Commonwealth's main base was located, 120 kilometers to the west, a 2-week march. Min-so laid out the defense plan. 3 observation posts set up, ropes with cans on the approaches, signal fires on 2 hills. Inside the wall, positions for shooters were prepared. They had weapons, not many. Marcus's sawed-off shotgun, Min-so's rifle, 2 hunting rifles Ray found on one of the routes, the pistol Jensen assembled from spare parts, and a crossbow. Tommy made it, from a car spring and a wooden stock, rough but powerful. The bolts pierced a board from 30 meters away. 6 firearms and a crossbow for 28 people. Min-so said that wasn't enough, catastrophically insufficient. If the Commonwealth came in full force, that's 60 people, armed, fanatical, who believe they're doing God's work. Against them, 6 barrels and an earthen rampart. Dan listened. Then he said he wasn't going to shoot. Min-so looked at him like he was crazy. Dan said the Commonwealth had a weakness, the same one everyone in this world has: food. Vance is leading people to war. War needs a supply train, food, water, time. 120 kilometers, 2 weeks. That's 14 days worth of rations for 50 to 60 people. At an average consumption of 1,500 calories per person per day, that's over 1 million calories. The Commonwealth doesn't have those kinds of reserves. Min-so confirmed it. The Commonwealth is barely scraping by. Vance considers hunger a test of faith. His people are thin and angry. They'll come with enough supplies for the trip there, but not back. Dan said that's exactly what he's counting on. If the siege lasts more than 2 weeks, the Commonwealth will run out of food, and then they'll face a choice: die of starvation under the walls, or accept what lies beyond them. Min-so said that fanatics don't give up. Dan said that fanatics are people, and people want to eat, even those who believe that starvation pleases God. He turned to Yuna. He asked how much food they could produce over the next 3 weeks. Yuna did the math. With hydroponics and the greenhouse and fish and potatoes, about 100,000 calories above current consumption. Dan nodded. He said that 100,000 calories was his weapon. Not bullets. Food. The Commonwealth arrived on the 161st day. 53 people. Armed. Crosses painted on their chests in white paint. Leading the way was Reverend Elijah Vance. Tall. Thin. His face was narrow and calm. His eyes were clear. He carried a staff and walked as if strolling through a park. Behind him were people. Men and women. Young and old. Some with weapons. Some with tools. Some with empty hands. They stopped 100 meters from the moat. They lined up in a semicircle. V stepped forward, alone. He stood so that he could be seen from the wall. He raised his hand, not in a threatening gesture, in greeting. Then he spoke. His voice was steady and strong, that very voice from the radio. He said he had not come as an enemy, that he had come as a shepherd, that he had heard of the valley, of warm water and bread and light, that all of this was beautiful, but all of this was a sin. Because silence is no accident. Silence is purification. The world was sick. The world was devouring itself. The world built and built and built until it suffocated on its own creations. And when silence came, it was not a punishment. It was medicine. Bitter, but necessary. And those who build again, those who gather and hoard and grow, those who try to bring back the old world, they prevent the medicine from working. They prolong the illness. Dan stood on the wall and listened. He didn't interrupt. Minso stood nearby with a rifle. Marcus with a sawed-off shotgun. Carl with a shotgun. Everyone was tense. Everyone was waiting for the signal. Dan didn't give the signal. He listened. Vance spoke for 15 minutes, without shouting, without threats, quietly and gently, like a teacher with a class. Then he said he was asking for one thing, that the residents of the valley open the gates, come out, leave everything behind, and go with him. He would show them another way, a way without walls, without supplies, without fear of loss, because those who have nothing fear nothing. Dan waited until he finished. Then he said one thing in reply. He asked if his people had eaten today. Vance fell silent. He hadn't expected that question. Dan repeated it. He asked when the last time his people had eaten a hot meal. Silence. Then someone in the Commonwealth crowd coughed. Vance said that the flesh doesn't matter, that the spirit is stronger than hunger. Dan said that the spirit doesn't digest protein, that he can see half his people have scurvy, that at least 3 have open wounds, that the woman in the second row on the left was pregnant and, judging by her appearance, hadn't eaten properly in a month, and that if Vance was truly a shepherd, his first duty was to feed his flock, not starve it in the name of an idea. Vance didn't answer. His face didn't change, but his people stirred. Dan saw it. Small movements, exchanges of glances, downcast eyes. They had heard, and they were hungry. The siege had begun. The Commonwealth had set up camp half a kilometer away. Tents, campfires, guard posts, professional. Vance had ex-military men, not many, 3 or 4, but they knew what they were doing. The first day passed quietly, the second too. On the third day, 2 from the Commonwealth tried to approach the wall at night. Minso spotted them, fired a warning shot. They left. On the 5th day, the Commonwealth blocked the road to the stream, or tried to. They didn't know that the valley had a water supply, didn't know that an underground ditch carried water straight to the reservoir, didn't know that the valley didn't depend on trips to the stream. Dan didn't tell them about it. Let them think they've cut off the water. Let them think when the valley starts suffering from thirst. And the valley drank water from the tap. Not from the tap, from the pipe, but close enough. On the 7th day of the siege, Dan sat in the control room and did the math. The Commonwealth had 53 people. The minimum daily caloric intake was 1,200 calories per person. That's 63,600 calories a day. 445,000 for the week. They had about 2 weeks' worth of supplies when they left, so there was about a week left. Dan waited. On the 8th day, a person approached the wall. Not Vance, a young woman. The very same pregnant woman from the second row. She stood by the moat and silently looked at the gate. Minso raised her rifle. Dan put his hand on the barrel and lowered it. He stepped out onto the wall. He looked at the woman. Her mark. 114 days. Low. Very low for a pregnant woman. She didn't ask for food. She hadn't asked for shelter. She just stood there and watched. Then she turned and walked back to the camp. Dan climbed down. He went to the kitchen, packed a bag. Potatoes, spinach, dried fish, boiled beans, salt, about 3,000 calories. He walked out the gate, alone, crossed the field, toward the Commonwealth camp. Marcus shouted after him. Minso aimed into the darkness behind him, covering his retreat. Dan reached the edge of the camp. He set the bag on the ground and left, without looking back. In the morning, the bag was empty. On the 9th day, he brought out another bag. On the 10th, another. 3,000 calories every day. Minso said he was feeding the enemy. Dan said he was feeding a pregnant woman. Minso said it was the same thing. Dan said no. On the 11th day, 3 men came to the wall. Not a pregnant woman. 3 men, young, with crosses on their chests. They laid their weapons on the ground in front of the moat, raised their hands, said they wanted to come in, that they wanted to eat, that Vance didn't know they were here. Dan opened the gate, let them in, fed them. Hot potatoes, fish soup, spinach, bread. Dolina had bread. Una had grown wheat on a small plot. First harvest, first batch of bread. Coarse, heavy, dark, but bread. The 3 of them ate and cried, quietly, ashamed. They believed in Vance. They believed sincerely. But the body is stronger than faith when it hasn't eaten in 10 days. Dan didn't lecture them, didn't try to convince them, didn't try to persuade them. He just fed them. Then he asked if they wanted to stay. 2 said yes. The 3rd shook his head, said he couldn't betray the Reverend. Dan gave him a bag of food and let him go. The 3rd went back to the camp with food. On the 12th day, 7 more came. On the 13th, 4. Every day, someone left from the Commonwealth camp and came to the gates of the valley. Dan let everyone in. He fed everyone. The system accepted the new people. Tags appeared above their heads, all low, all short. The lowest was 23 days, a 50-year-old man with an open sore on his back. Sarah attended to him immediately. On 14th day of the siege, 19 people remained in the Commonwealth camp. Of the 53, 34 had crossed into the valley. Vance stood before the gates, alone, a staff in his hand, his face calm, just as it always was. Not a shadow of doubt, not a shadow of anger. He looked at Dan on the wall and said that Dan had built Babylon, that Babylon would fall, that everything created by human hands would crumble because that is how the world works. Dan listened. Then he asked Vance if he wanted to eat. Vance didn't answer. He turned. He left. 19 people left with him, westward, back. The siege was over. 9 days. Not a single shot fired. 34 new residents. The total population of the valley, 62 people. After the siege, the valley changed. Not on the outside, on the inside. 62 people is no longer a family. It's a settlement. And a settlement needs laws. The first conflict happened on the 3rd day after the siege was lifted. Carl hit one of the former members of the Commonwealth, a man named Simon. Simon refused to work on the construction of the 2nd tier. He said that digging in the ground was a sin, that he had come here to eat, not to serve a new master. Carl smashed into him, without warning. Simon fell, blood from his nose. Marcus pulled Carl away. Minso took Simon to Sarah. Dan stood and watched, and realized that he had been putting off this moment since day 1. Law, rules, justice. He didn't want to be a judge, didn't want to be a leader. didn't want to decide who was right and who was wrong. He wanted to count jars and monitor the temperature in the greenhouse. But 62 people can't live without rules. Not in this world. Not after everything. That evening, he called a general assembly, all 62 people. In the dining hall, which had been expanded into a common room, he stood before them and said he needed help. Not with digging, not with construction, with the rules. He said he was a storekeeper. He knew how to count and store and distribute, but he didn't know how to judge people. That wasn't his job. He said he needed a council, 5 people, to be chosen by everyone, not by him, by everyone. And the council would settle disputes, and he would do what he knew how to do: feed, build, count. There was silence. Then Marcus raised his hand and said he nominated Min-so. Someone nominated Reed. Someone nominated Yuna. Among the new former members of the Commonwealth, a woman named Laura nominated herself. She said that before the silence she had been a lawyer, that she knew the law, that not all of the law was dead, that some principles were older than any world. Dan looked at her. Mark, 230 days. She had gone from 26 to 3 in 3 weeks in the valley. He nodded. They voted. They raised their hands. Min-so, Reed, Yuna, Laura, and the 5th. Dan thought they would choose Marcus. They chose Emily. 19-year-old Emily, who barely spoke and who counted out children's portions. The children chose her. All 5 raised their hands, and the adults followed suit. Because if the children trust them, it must be for a reason. The Council of 5. First decision. Carl received 3 days without meat rations for the blow. Simon received mandatory 4 hours of community service per day. Not a punishment, a rule for everyone. Whoever eats, works. Whoever cannot work physically, works in another way. Teaches, heals, counts, seams. Everyone contributes. Carl accepted the punishment in silence. Simon went out to dig the next morning, not because he was forced to, but because everyone else was digging nearby, and because after 4 hours of work, he was given hot soup, and he realized that soup tastes better when you've earned it. On the 181st day, Dan uncovered an underground level. The system unlocked the module after the population exceeded 50 people and the trust level reached 3. An underground level, 200 square meters beneath the warehouse. The system hadn't dug them out. It showed that they already existed. An old foundation. Old basements of a neighboring building that had collapsed decades ago. Underground utilities. All that space was dead, cluttered, flooded. The system drained it, reinforced the walls, leveled the floor. In 3 days. Dan went down there with a flashlight and could feel the building breathing around him. 200 square meters. That's sleeping space for 30 people. It's a storage area. It's a shelter in case of an attack. It's a place that's warm in winter because the ground retains heat better than the air. Carl followed him down. He whistled. He said that in Tashina, a developer would have asked for $500,000 for a basement like this. Dan said that right now, it was free. They only needed hands and time. The biogas generator was the next breakthrough. Reed spent a month building it. The principle is simple. Organic waste rots in a sealed pit. Methane is released. Methane burns. The combustion spins a turbine. The turbine generates electricity. It sounds simple. In practice, it was agonizing. 3 attempts. The first pit leaked. The second didn't produce enough gas. The third exploded. A small explosion. Reed got away with singed eyebrows and lost dignity. Min-so said she'd seen a lot of things explode, and that this was a pathetic explosion. Reed took offense. Then he laughed. The 4th attempt was a success. A small biogas generator, twice as powerful as the water wheel, and most importantly, stable. There's always waste. 62 people produce enough organic waste to keep the generator running around the clock. The system confirmed it. Power supply level 2, biogas generator, stable, new modules available. The weapons workshop, 2nd underground level, radio broadcasting. Dan chose radio broadcasting, Not the workshop, not the level. Radio. Reed set up the transmitter. Low power. Broadcast radius about 30 kilometers. Not much, but enough. Dan went on the air on the 191st day, in the evening. The frequency he chose didn't match either Fort or the Commonwealth. Clear. He said simply that there is a place called the Valley, that there is food here, water, warmth, medicine, that if anyone is listening and has nowhere to go, they should head northeast to 2 dead highways. Between them lies the valley. Between the hills, a warehouse. The gates are open. He repeated it 3 times. Then he turned off the transmitter. Minso said he'd just invited everyone, including the collectors, to visit. Dan said yes. Minso asked if he understood what he was doing. Dan said he did, that if they hid and shut themselves away and lived quietly, they'd last a year, maybe 2. But sooner or later, someone will come, either the collectors or Drake or someone else, and then it will be 60 against 300, and they'll lose. The only way to survive is to grow, faster than the threat grows. People aren't expendable. People are a resource. Every new person is a new pair of hands, a new skill, a new strength. Minso was silent. Then she said he was risking everything. Dan said that not taking risks was a risk too, just a slow one. Over the next 3 weeks, 41 people came to the valley, in groups, 2, 3, 7 at a time, from different places, from dead towns, from the roads, from fallen strongholds. Everyone had heard the radio. Everyone was coming. The valley's population, 103 people. The system was updated. Warehouse number 0. Condition, good. Population, 103. Status, settlement. On the 220th day, Dan sent out the first missionary team, 10 people, led by Ray. Grant was with her. 2 former associates who turned out to be good carpenters, a mechanic, a medic from the new recruits, a former paramedic, and 4 fighters who Minso had trained for 3 months. The objective? An old railroad depot 80 kilometers to the south. Ray found it on the map. The depot is a warehouse, an open-air hangar. The system can accept it. Dan couldn't activate it personally, too far away. But the system showed a possibility. Remote activation. Level 2 binding allows the operator to initiate activation through a trusted representative. Requires the physical presence of the trusted representative in the target building and radio contact with the operator. The trusted representative. Dan chose Ray, not Minso, not Yoon, not Marcus. Ray. Because Ray knew the roads. Because Ray was a logistics specialist. Because Ray thought like him. Routes, waypoints, distances. She didn't build things. She delivered them. Ray stood before him on the day of departure. Backpack on her back, rifle on her shoulder, map in her pocket, radio on her belt. She looked up at him because she was a head shorter. Then she said that if he messed everything up here without her, she'd come back and give him an earful. Dan said he was a storekeeper. He didn't ruin anything. Ray smirked. Then she looked at her mug on the shelf in the dining hall, then at his. Then she left, through the gate, down the road, south. Dan stood on the wall and watched until 10 figures disappeared behind the hill. Then he climbed down and went to the greenhouse, because Yuna's tomatoes needed staking, and if he didn't stake them today, the stems would snap under the weight of the fruit. Tomatoes. There were tomatoes in the valley. Red, ripe, real ones. Nora tasted a tomato and said it was the strangest thing she'd ever eaten. Sweet and sour at the same time. Then she asked for more. On the 225th day, the radio crackled. Ray's voice, distant, distorted, but hers. She said they'd made it. The depot was in place, intact, huge. 3 hangars, 2 destroyed, 1 standing. 3 times the size of Warehouse 0. She said she was ready. Dan closed his eyes. The system responded. Remote activation. Target, Warehouse Depot. Distance, 81 kilometers. Authorized representative, Rachel O'Brien. Begin. Dan said yes. Through the radio, he heard Ray inhale. Then she said quietly what she felt, as if the building were waking up, as if the walls were beginning to see. The system displayed a new window. Warehouse number 1, emergency status. Begin restoration. 2 warehouses, 2 points on the map, 1 network. Dan opened his notebook. He wrote it down. Warehouse number 1, coordinates, status. Ray as point of contact, 10 personnel. Resource requirements, first convoy, seeds from Yuna, medicines from Sarah, tools, food for the first 2 weeks. Logistics, route, 81 kilometers, 2 days on foot, daytime travel, overnight stay at a waypoint, return convoy, what the depot can provide to the valley. Ray listed it over the radio. Rails, lots of rails. Steel, that's metal, that's tools, that's weapons if needed. Car axles, bearings, wheels, for carts, for the mill, for generators. A tanker with leftover fuel oil. Fuel oil is fuel, for heating, for lighting. The depot was a gold mine, not of food, but of materials, exactly what the valley lacked. Dan organized the first caravan in 3 days, 12 people, with carts, with cargo, seeds, water, beans, potatoes, medicines. Minso sent 4 fighters for protection. The caravan headed south. It returned 5 days later, with rails, with bearings, with hope. Between the 230th and 250th days, the valley grew like a living organism. The population, 140 people. The hydroponic system ran around the clock. Yuna trained 4 assistants. The greenhouse was expanded to 120 square meters. Sarah opened a second medical ward in the underground level. She trained 2 assistants. Reed built a mill. The water wheel now not only generated electricity, but also threshed grain. Coarse flour, dark, but flour. Bread became a daily occurrence, the norm, not a luxury. Emily turned the children's meals into a school. 15 children, 2 hours every morning. She taught them to read, to count. She told them about the world as it used to be. Abraham was gone, but his piano stood in the corner. And one of the girls from the former community began to learn to play, by ear, off-key, out of tune, but there were melodies. Minso built a defense system she called the Ring, the Outer Ring, observation posts on 3 hills, duty around the clock. The Middle Ring, a moat and a rampart, a palisade, firing positions. The Inner Ring, a supply depot, an underground level, the last line of defense. She trained 20 combat-ready fighters, armed and unarmed. Crossbows, spears, slings. Not an army, but a militia. On the 248th day, the radio brought news. A voice on the airwaves, unfamiliar. The canyon gatherers had begun their march, northward. 300 men, led by the butcher. They were heading for the valley. Dan listened and took notes. 300 men, against his 140, of whom 20 were combat ready. Even counting warehouse number 1 and its 10 men, 30 against 300. The math of death. Minso stood nearby. She was silent. Then she said they had about 3 weeks. The collectors move slowly. They loot along the way. They gather people. By the time they arrive, there could be more than 300 of them. Dan closed his notebook. He looked at her, said he needed to think it over. Minso nodded. She left. Dan remained alone in the control room, in front of the map, in front of the numbers, in front of the markers he knew by heart. 140 people, 140 lives, 140 countdowns he moved up every day. And now someone was coming to reset them all to 0. The system flashed silently. New information. Carrier detected. Hunter system. Distance approximately 200 kilometers. Direction southwest. Moving toward Warehouse 0. Dan read it. Carrier. Hunter. butcher. He's not just the thug. He's just like Dan, from the same place, from the same death, from the same, only with a different system. A system that grows stronger through what is taken away, through what is killed, through what is destroyed. A mirror. Dan looked at the map and thought, and for the first time in 8 months, he didn't know the answer. The numbers didn't add up. Food wouldn't help against 300 armed men. The walls wouldn't hold. A pumped 20 men won't stop an army. Everything he had built, greenhouses, hydroponics, medicine, the school, bread, tomatoes, the piano, none of it would matter if the butcher reached the walls. He sat in silence. Then he stood up. He walked out of the control room. He passed through the warehouse, past the kitchen where Emily was slicing bread for the children, past the medical station where Sarah was bandaging someone's arm, past the greenhouse where Yuna was checking the tomatoes, past the wall where Min-so stood on guard, gazing into the darkness, past the piano where a girl was pressing the keys and humming something. He walked past all of this and went out through the gate. He stood at the edge of the moat. He looked south, at the road, at the horizon beyond which, somewhere, 300 people were marching, led by a man whose power was the opposite of his own. He builds, that man destroys. He preserves, that man takes. He gives people days, that man takes them away. And someone thought this up. Someone gave them both power and set them against each other and is watching to see which philosophy will prevail. Dan stood at the edge of the moat and made his decision. And the decision came, not like a flash, not like an epiphany, like a line on a delivery slip. Calm, clear, obvious. He returned to the control room and began to write a plan. 312 men stood before the walls of the valley on the 270th day, more than expected. The butcher had gathered them along the way. Every dead town had given him men. Not volunteers, those who had no choice. Come with us, or stay and die alone. 312. Of those, about 150 were real fighters, according to Min-so's estimate. The rest were the supply train, porters, those whom the butcher used as cannon fodder. The butcher stood at the front. Dan saw him from the wall, a large man, broad-shouldered, no helmet, no armor, short dark hair, a calm face, not evil, ordinary. The face of a man who drank coffee in the morning and drove to work at some office. A face from the past world. The system showed a mark, 2,300 days, more than 6 years. Everyone around Dan had marks in the hundreds, a year and a half, 2 if he was lucky. But the butcher had 6 years. The hunter's system fed him with other people's lives. Every life taken added time to his. Every destroyed village made him stronger. The flip side of what Dan was doing. Dan gave people days. The butcher took them and kept them for himself. 2 survival strategies, 1 experiment. The butcher raised his hand, not in greeting, in demand of silence. His army fell silent. He looked at the wall, at the moat, at the palisade. Then he shouted. His voice was low and steady. He asked who the storekeeper was. Dan wasn't surprised. The butcher knew. The system had told him, just as the system had told Dan. The 2 bearers sensed each other. Dan stood on the wall. Next to him were Min-so and Marcus, Carl. 20 fighters in position, crossbows, rifles, spears, a moat with stakes at the bottom, the wall. Everything they had built in 9 months, against 312. Dan didn't answer the shout. He climbed down from the wall. He entered the control room. He sat down at the table and started working, just like he did every day. Min-so followed him in. She asked what he was doing. Dan said he was assigning roles. Who goes where? What goes where? Left flank, right flank, center. Water supply at the positions. Hot meals every 4 hours. Sarah is ready at the medical station. 2 assistants with her. A supply of bandages, antiseptic, boiling water. Reed is by the generator. The lights mustn't go out. Yuna is in the greenhouse. The seedlings won't wait. If the battle lasts for days, the food must keep growing. Emily is with the children in the underground level. 15 children, underground, safe. Minso listened and nodded. Then she asked what he would do when they went to the wall. Dan said he would stay here and coordinate. Minso asked who would go to the wall. Dan said anyone who decided to go. He wouldn't give orders. Minso said she would go. Dan nodded. Minso stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that he was the only commander in 10 years whom she trusted, not because he was strong, but because he had never sent her where she shouldn't have gone. She left. The first attack came at dawn on the 271st day. 30 of the butcher's men went to the southern wall, with ladders, with ropes. Minso gave the order. The crossbows fired their first volley. 4 bolts hit their mark. 2 of the attackers fell, wounded. The rest retreated, quickly. They were testing the defenses. Day 2. A night raid. 5 men tried to swim across the moat from the west. Marcus heard a splash. He sounded the alarm. Minso and 2 fighters met them at the edge. 2 were wounded. 3 retreated. Day 3. Silence. Day 4. Silence. The butcher was waiting. Dan, too. He sat in the control room and counted. The butcher had 312 men, a minimum consumption of 400,000 calories a day. He had no hydroponics, no greenhouses, no refrigerator, no running water. He was dragging out his supply train, but the supply train would eventually run out. The same logic applied to the Commonwealth, only the scale was different. The Commonwealth held out for 14 days. The collectors could hold out longer, but not indefinitely. On the 5th day, the butcher approached the wall, alone, unarmed. He stood by the moat. He looked up. Dan stepped out onto the wall. They looked at each other. 2 people from the dead world, 2 bearers, 2 poles of a single experiment. The butcher spoke. He said he knew who Dan was, that he could sense his system, that he could see his building, that the hunter's system showed him everything Dan had built, every module, every wall, every bush in the greenhouse, and it told him that all of this could be taken, that if he destroyed the valley, his system would gain more power than any destroyed village had ever provided, because Dan built with his soul, and what is built with the soul yields more when destroyed. Dan listened. Then he asked what the butcher's name had been before this world. The butcher paused. Then he said, Nathan Rose, an accountant from Denver. Dan nodded. An accountant. He counted numbers too, only now he counts different ones. Dan asked if Nathan remembered how he died. Nathan said he did. An aneurysm, at his desk, face down on the keyboard. Dan said he remembered the headlights in the parking lot. They were silent, 2 dead men in a strange world. Then Dan said he wouldn't fight him. Nathan narrowed his eyes. He asked what that meant. Dan said that in an hour he would walk out through the gate, alone, unarmed, and let Nathan watch. On the 6th day of the siege, at dawn, Dan opened the valley's gate. Minso stood nearby, her face pale. Marcus clenched his fists. Carl cursed under his breath. Yuna silently held his sleeve for 2 seconds. Then she let go. Dan stepped out, alone, unarmed, unarmored, in a work jacket and boots. He walked across the field toward the butcher's army. 312 people were staring at one man. Dan walked steadily, neither fast nor slow, just as he walked through the warehouse between the shelves on the night shift. The ordinary stride of an ordinary man. He stopped 30 meters from the front row. Then he turned around. Behind him, the gates were open, and people were coming out of them, one by one, 140 people. Each was carrying something in their hands. Marcus was first, a loaf of bread in his hands. Behind him, Sarah, a first aid kit and a bottle of antiseptic. Behind her, Yuna, a bag of seeds. Behind her, Reed, a light bulb on a string. Behind him, Carl, a hammer and a handful of nails. Behind him, Tommy, a bundle of dried fish. Behind him, Alice, a blanket she had sewn herself. Behind her, Emily, a mug, a tin one, with a name scratched into it, an empty name, for someone she didn't know yet. The rest followed behind them. Each carried a jar, a bunch of greens, potatoes, a knife, a needle, a coil of rope, a candle, a spoon, a child's drawing, something small and specific, something that made sense, not weapons, gifts. They walked and stopped in a semicircle around Dan, facing the army of collectors. And Nora was walking, 7 years old, hand in hand with Owen. In her hands, she held a tomato, red, ripe. She carried it like a treasure, with both hands. The butcher watched, his army watched. 312 men who had come to plunder and kill stood and watched the 140 people who had come out to meet them with bread and tomatoes and blankets. Silence. Absolute. Even the wind had fallen silent. Then someone in the back rows of the gatherers lowered their weapon. Then another. Then a woman from the supply train stepped out of line and took a step toward the valley. Then a man. Then 2 more. The butcher stood and watched. His face was changing. Not anger, not fear, something else. The hunter's system operated through taking. It grew stronger when he took. But you can't take what's offered to you. You can't take what's given voluntarily. You can't break the gesture. The system was malfunctioning. Dan could see it. The butcher's mark was flickering. 2,300, 2,200, 2,100. It was dropping. Not because the butcher was weakening, but because his system didn't know what to do with a gift. It was built on violence, on seizure, on loss. But here there was no loss. Here there was an offer. By sunset, 168 men from the butcher's army had defected to the valley. More than half. They came 1 by 1, 2 by 2, 5 at a time. They laid down their weapons by the ditch and accepted bread and soup and blankets and a place by the fire. Sarah worked nonstop. Wounds, infections, exhaustion, scurvy. She and 2 assistants treated the wounded until nightfall. Minsu organized accommodations. The underground level took in 50 people. The rest in tents behind the wall. Yuna counted the food supplies. There was enough, just barely, but there was enough. Hydroponics and greenhouses and a refrigerator and fish and potatoes, everything was working. The butcher stood in the middle of the field. 144 people remained around him. The core, the loyal ones, those who had been with him from the very beginning, those who had lived by his rules for too long to accept any others. He looked at Dan. Dan looked at him. Then the butcher turned and walked away, without a word, without a threat. 144 people followed him, south, back to the canyon. Dan stood and watched his back. Nathan Rose's tag flickered distant and dim. 1,800. Down 500 in a single day. The hunter's system was giving back what it had accumulated, because people were leaving him of their own free will, and everyone who left took a piece of his power with them. He would return. Dan knew it. The butcher isn't one to give up. But today he had lost. Not a battle, not a war, an argument. A philosophical argument that began when someone gave 2 dead men from another world 2 opposing powers and said, "Show me which one is right." That evening, Dan sat in the control room, in front of the map, in front of a notebook. The valley's population, including the collectors who had crossed over. 308 people. 308 marks. 308 lives. He opened a new page, wrote at the top, "Warehouse number 2, a question mark." Then he crossed out the question mark, wrote a period. Then, in greenhouse number 3, the emergency temperature sensor went off. The system flashed red. The temperature in zone 3 had dropped below critical. Yuna's tomato seedlings. 8 months of work. If it isn't fixed now, everything will freeze by morning. Dan stood up. He closed his notebook, put on his jacket, left the control room. He went to the greenhouse. The sky over the valley was dark, gray as always, but through the gray, in one spot near the horizon, light was breaking through. Dim, warm, as if someone had cracked open the door to a room where a lamp was burning. Dan raised his head. He looked. The sun. For the first time in 8 years, it had broken through the veil. Not completely. A slit, a ray, a strip of gold against the gray. He stood there and watched for 3 seconds. Then he went into the greenhouse. Because the seedlings won't wait. But the sun will wait.